Long before compasses, maps, or glowing screens, sailors crossed entire oceans guided by things most of us barely notice. The pull of the tides, the movement of the stars, the quiet rhythm of waves beneath a wooden hull. Here on the Made for Sleep channel, we slow history down and drift through stories like these. Tonight we'll follow how prehistoric sailors learned to navigate the open oceans using nothing more than patience, observation, and the subtle language of the sea. Let the rain settle softly around you. And if you feel like it, tell me how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. The ocean has always been both highway and mystery, stretching between shores that early humans could barely imagine reaching. Long before compasses pointed north or maps showed the curve of coastlines, people were already crossing open water, guided by observations so subtle that modern sailors would struggle to recognise them as navigation at all. This is the story of how they did it, and what they understood about the sea that we've only recently begun to remember. You're sitting on a limestone outcrop somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, perhaps 12,000 years ago, watching the water move in ways that most people today would never notice. The sea isn't just rising and falling with the tide, it's doing something more complicated than that. Something that takes patience to observe and years to understand fully. The sun hangs low enough that you can see the surface texture of the water change as different currents intersect about 50 metres offshore. There's a line where the smooth water meets slightly choppy water, and that line stays in roughly the same place despite the wind shifting from northwest to west over the past hour. You've been watching this spot for 3 days now, and the line moves with the tide but always returns to approximately the same position when the tide returns to the same height. Your father showed you this technique when you were barely tall enough to see over the coastal rocks. He would bring you here during different phases of the moon, different seasons, different weather conditions. At first, you thought he was simply staring at water for no reason. Children think many things their parents do are pointless until the pattern reveals itself. The pattern took almost 2 years to reveal itself fully. Your father never explained it outright. He just kept bringing you back to this same outcrop, asking you what you saw, waiting while you described the obvious things like wave height and wind direction. Eventually you started noticing the things that didn't change, the permanent features of the water that existed beneath the temporary conditions everyone else noticed. That line where the currents meet marks the edge of a freshwater plume coming from a river mouth about 2 kilometres up the coast. The freshwater flows out across the top of the denser salt water, creating a lens that you can see if you know what to look for. When the tide is rising, the lens extends further offshore. When the tide is falling, it pulls back closer to shore. But the river flow stays constant, which means the lens always returns to this same basic shape and position at the same point in the tidal cycle. You can't see the river mouth from here. The coast curves in a way that blocks the direct view. But you know exactly where it is because of how the water behaves in this spot. And you know that freshwater plumes create navigation markers that work even in fog, even at night, even when every other reference point disappears. The limestone you're sitting on is warm from the afternoon sun, and the warmth seeps through the sealskin you're wearing, despite the fact that seals won't be hunted in this region for another several thousand years. Historical accuracy regarding seal populations in the Mediterranean during the Mesolithic period would interrupt the flow here, so let's just say you're dressed in something made from an animal, and the rock is warm, and you're learning to read water the way later humans will learn to read text. Your people don't have a word for navigation. The concept hasn't been separated out from the general act of travelling across water to reach resources that only exist in other places. You have words for different types of water movement, different types of shoreline, different types of sky conditions, and different types of mistakes that can kill you if you don't pay attention. But navigation as a distinct skill that could be taught in discrete lessons, that idea won't exist for thousands of years. Instead, you have something more integrated into daily survival. You know that certain shellfish beds are only accessible during the lowest tides, which occur during the new moon and full moon. You know that certain fishing grounds are only productive when specific currents are running, which happens at predictable times relative to the tide and season. You know that the small island visible on clear days to the west becomes accessible by raft when the wind has been blowing from the east for at least 2 days, creating a surface current that will help carry you there and back. This knowledge doesn't feel like specialised information. It feels like knowing that fire is hot and that falling from heights causes injury. It's simply how the world works, and anyone who spends enough time on the water eventually learns it or dies before they can pass along their genes. Evolution has a way of teaching lessons that stick. The water is doing something different now as the afternoon progresses toward evening. The line where the currents meet is starting to break up into swirls and eddies instead of maintaining its clean boundary. This happens every day about 2 hours before sunset, and it signals that the offshore wind that usually picks up in the evening is about to start. The eddies form because the wind hasn't arrived yet, but the tidal current has already shifted into its transitional phase, creating unstable conditions in the surface layer. You could set out in a raft right now and ride that offshore wind to deeper water where larger fish congregate at dusk. The evening fishing runs are part of your regular routine during this season, but you're not going fishing today. You're watching the water because tomorrow you're making a longer journey, the kind that requires more than just knowing where the fish are. Tomorrow you're crossing to the island that's usually just a hazy shape on the western horizon. The crossing takes most of a day when conditions are right, and it requires understanding not just the surface wind and current, but also the deeper patterns that determine whether you'll be able to make the return journey 3 days later, when the shellfish you're going to harvest have been properly processed and dried. The island sits about 30 kilometres offshore, far enough that it disappears completely in haze or fog, far enough that the currents between here and there behave differently than the coastal currents you can observe from shore. Your father has made the crossing perhaps 50 times in his life. You've made it 6 times, always accompanied by someone more experienced, always learning additional details about what to watch for. This time you're going with 3 other people, none of them your father, and you're responsible for reading the initial conditions that will determine whether the group decides to proceed or wait another day. It's a test, though nobody has framed it that way. Your people don't really do formal tests of skills. They just put you in situations where you need to use what you know, and then everyone sees whether you survive and make good decisions. The sun is getting lower, the offshore wind still hasn't arrived, the water surface is taking on that peculiar glassy quality that happens in the late afternoon when the land is still warm, but the sea breeze has died out and the evening wind hasn't filled in yet. This glassy period usually lasts about 20 minutes this time of year. You know this because you've watched it hundreds of times. A bird is fishing in the area where the currents were meeting earlier. It's diving repeatedly in a spot that has moved about 10 metres offshore from where the line was visible an hour ago. The bird is following a school of small fish, and the fish are following the plankton that accumulates along density boundaries in the water. Even though you can't see the line anymore, the bird is showing you where it still exists beneath the surface. Birds are going to turn out to be incredibly important in early ocean navigation, but we'll get to that later. For now, just notice that the bird is providing information about invisible water structures, and that you're incorporating that information into your mental model of how the local currents are behaving today compared to how they normally behave at this point in the tidal cycle during this phase of the moon in this season. Your mental model is complex enough that it would take a modern oceanographer with computer simulations to fully replicate it. But you don't think of it as complex. You think of it as simply paying attention to what the water is doing, the same way someone might pay attention to which plants are edible or which animals are dangerous. It's survival information that happens to involve fluid dynamics and tidal mechanics, though you have no concept of either term. The offshore wind arrives. You feel it on your face before you see it ruffle the water surface. It's coming from slightly north of east, which is normal for this time of year, but different from the southeast wind that was blowing yesterday. The shift in wind direction means the surface currents tomorrow will be running at a slightly different angle than they did during your last crossing 3 weeks ago. Not a major difference, but enough that you'll need to adjust your departure angle by perhaps 10 degrees to compensate. 10 degrees is a tiny adjustment, barely noticeable if you're watching someone else make it. But over the course of a 30-kilometre crossing, 10 degrees means the difference between arriving at the intended beach on the island versus arriving at the rocky headland 2 kilometres north, where landing a raft is nearly impossible. Your ancestors are going to get very good at making tiny adjustments, and they're going to do it without instruments or reference points beyond what they can see and feel. You stand up from the limestone outcrop. Your legs are stiff from sitting still for several hours. The warmth from the rock has made you slightly sleepy in that pleasant way that happens when you've been comfortable for a while. You stretch, working the stiffness out of your lower back, and take one more long look at the water surface now that the wind has properly filled in. The pattern of small waves forming in the wind makes a texture that you'll remember tomorrow when you're out of sight of land. and need to maintain a consistent angle relative to the wind direction. Waves are like fingerprints. Each wind creates a slightly different pattern depending on its strength and steadiness. Tomorrow's wind will probably be similar to what you're seeing now, which means the wave pattern will be similar, which means you'll be able to steer by feel, even if the sun is obscured by high clouds. You make your way back along the coastal rocks toward the cluster of shelters where your group lives. The shelters are about 1 kilometre inland, close enough to the coast that you can reach the water quickly, but far enough that storm surges don't threaten the structures. The path involves scrambling over rocks, following a route that stays above the highest tide line but below the scrubby vegetation that marks the true land. This route is going to stay in use for thousands of years, though later people will call it something else and use it for different reasons. Right now it's just the way you get between the water and the living area. The limestone is worn smooth in certain spots where generations of feet have passed. You can feel the difference between the smooth worn spots and the rough unworn surface, and you use that texture information to navigate the path even as the light begins to fail. The raft sits on the beach where the last tide left it, above the rack line but not so far above that the next high tide won't refloat it easily. Your father built this raft 3 years ago using a technique his father taught him, which involves lashing together large pieces of driftwood with cordage made from plant fibres that someone else spent weeks preparing. The construction is simple but effective. Calling it a boat would be generous. It's more like a floating platform that happens to support weight and remain somewhat intact when waves pass over it. You're standing next to the raft in the pre-dawn darkness, running your hands over the lashings to check for wear or damage that might have occurred since the last voyage. The wood itself is fine. Dead wood becomes more buoyant as it dries out and loses weight, but the lashings are the weak point. Cordage made from plant fibres degrades slowly when exposed to salt water, and eventually it becomes unreliable. Checking the lashings isn't something you do because someone told you to. It's something you do because the one time your father didn't check them carefully, he ended up swimming back to shore while his raft disintegrated around him. The other 3 people who will be making the crossing with you are doing their own preparations. One of them is checking the supplies that will be loaded onto the raft: dried fish, water containers made from gourds, extra cordage, stone tools wrapped in hide to keep them dry. Another is studying the sky, looking at the stars that are still visible in the pre-dawn darkness and checking their positions against the familiar constellations that mark direction and time of night. The third person is standing at the water's edge, watching how the waves are breaking on the beach and listening to the sound they make when they surge up the sand and then retreat. Wave sounds provide information that most modern people have forgotten how to interpret. The pitch and rhythm of waves breaking on a beach tell you about the wave period, which tells you about the distance the waves have travelled, which tells you about where the wind was blowing yesterday and the day before. Long period waves with a deep rumbling sound come from distant storms. Short period waves with a sharper slapping sound come from local winds. Right now the waves have a medium period and a consistent rhythm, which means yesterday's wind pattern is continuing, and tomorrow's wind will probably be similar. Probably. Weather forecasting 12,000 years ago is not an exact science, though arguably it's more accurate than modern forecasting in some ways, because it's based entirely on direct observation, rather than on computer models that can drift away from reality. You either learn to read the actual sky and water, or you make bad decisions and experience consequences. There's no buffer of technology to protect you from incorrect assessments. The sky's lightening in the east. The stars are fading except for the brightest ones, which will remain visible for another 10 or 15 minutes. One star in particular catches your attention, a bright point near the eastern horizon that marks the direction you'll be heading once you launch. This star rises in the same spot every morning during this season, and the island you're travelling to lies almost directly beneath where that star appears when it first becomes visible at dawn. Using a star that's close to the horizon is tricky because atmospheric refraction makes its position shift slightly depending on air temperature and humidity. But you've made enough crossings to know how much correction to apply. When the star first appears, it's displaced slightly to the right of where it will be once it's fully above the horizon, so you aim slightly left of where you see it, compensating for an optical effect you couldn't possibly explain, but have learned to account for through repetition. The supplies are loaded. The raft sits properly balanced with weight distributed so it won't tip if someone shifts position unexpectedly. Everyone is ready, but nobody is rushing to push off because the tide isn't quite right yet. You need to launch during the last hour of the falling tide so that the tidal current will carry you offshore while you're still fresh and paddling strongly. Launching too early means fighting the current. Launching too late means missing the most favourable tidal phase and having to work much harder during the middle portion of the crossing. Timing the launch requires knowing exactly where you are in the tidal cycle, which requires having paid attention to when high tide occurred yesterday and knowing how much later high tide happens each day as the moon progresses through its monthly cycle. Right now, you're about 6 days past full moon, which means high tide is occurring roughly 3 hours later each day compared to when it was occurring at the full moon. Yesterday's high tide was around midnight, which means today's will be around 3 in the morning, which means the tide has been falling for maybe 90 minutes and has another 2 hours to go before low tide. You know all of this without consciously calculating it because you've been tracking tides your entire life. It's like knowing what time of day it is based on the position of the sun, not something you have to think about, just something you know because you've observed it so many times that the pattern exists in your mind as automatic knowledge. The person who is watching the waves walks back from the water's edge and nods. The wave pattern has shifted slightly in the last few minutes, indicating that the tidal current has strengthened as the tide approaches its maximum falling rate. This is the signal everyone was waiting for. Time to push off. 4 people can move a raft much more easily than 1 person, though the raft still drags heavily through the sand until it reaches the wet zone where wave action has made the surface slick. Then it glides more easily, and everyone wades into the water alongside it, waiting for a gap between wave sets to push it out through the small surf zone that exists here, even on calm days. The water is cold. Not dangerously cold, but cold enough that you feel it immediately through the animal hide you're wearing. The cold is actually useful because it keeps you alert and focused during the initial phase of the crossing when most accidents happen. Drowning is more common in warm water than cold water, statistically speaking, because people in warm water become relaxed and careless, while people in cold water stay sharp. A gap appears between wave sets. Everyone pushes together. The raft floats free and begins drifting outward on the backwash from the last wave. You pull yourself up onto the platform, water streaming from your legs. The other 3 people do the same, and then everyone starts paddling with the broad wooden paddles that were carved from driftwood and shaped over fires until they had the right curve and thickness. Paddling a raft is different from paddling a canoe or kayak. The raft has almost no directional stability, which means it wants to spin in response to uneven paddle strokes. Keeping it moving in a straight line requires coordination between paddlers and constant tiny corrections. The person in front sets the rhythm and direction. The person in back makes steering adjustments. The 2 people in the middle provide power and watch for problems. You're in the back position today, which means you're responsible for keeping the raft aligned with the target direction, while everyone else focuses on paddling efficiently. It's a position that requires more attention than strength, and it's often given to younger people who are still learning the subtle cues that indicate when the raft is drifting off course, before the drift becomes visible. The star you were using as a directional reference is now fully risen and is displaced too high above the horizon to be useful. But the sun is starting to illuminate the eastern sky with that particular quality of light that happens in the half hour before sunrise. The light is enough to see the texture of the water surface, which shows you the wind direction through the pattern of tiny ripples that form perpendicular to the wind flow. You're paddling at an angle slightly to the left of directly into the wind, which feels wrong at first but becomes right when you account for the tidal current that's pushing you offshore and slightly to the south. The current will continue pushing you south throughout the morning as the tide falls and then reverses and begins rising again. By early afternoon, when the current shifts back to the north, you'll need to adjust your paddling angle to compensate in the opposite direction. This is getting complicated, and if you were trying to figure it out intellectually, it would be nearly impossible to keep track of all the variables. Wind direction and speed, current direction and speed, paddle angle, raft drift, target location, time of day, phase of tide, distance travelled, distance remaining. Trying to process all of that consciously would overload anyone's mental capacity. But you're not processing it consciously. You're processing it the same way you process walking across uneven ground without thinking about where to place each foot. Your brain is handling the calculations automatically, integrating information from your eyes and skin and inner ear, making continuous micro-adjustments to paddle angle and stroke rhythm without any conscious effort. Modern cognitive scientists would call this embodied cognition, or ecological perception, but those terms wouldn't mean anything to you. You'd just say you're steering the raft, though even that explanation would seem unnecessarily complicated. You're doing what needs to be done to get where you're going, that's all. The shore is receding behind you. You can still see details of the coastline, individual rocks, variations in cliff height, areas where vegetation comes down close to the water. The visibility is good enough that you could turn back right now with no difficulty finding your way home, but in another 20 minutes the details will fade and the coastline will become a simple, dark line between water and sky. And 20 minutes after that, the line will drop below the horizon entirely and you'll be out of sight of land. Out of sight of land feels different in ways that are hard to describe if you've never experienced it. The water stretches in every direction to a perfectly circular horizon, and that horizon is closer than you'd expect, only about 5 kilometers away when you're sitting on a raft at water level. The world has suddenly become much smaller, and you're at the center of a moving circle that travels with you but never gets you any closer to its edges. The absence of reference points changes how you perceive motion. When you can see the shore, you can tell instantly whether you're moving toward it or away from it, whether you're being pushed sideways by current, whether you're making progress or just staying in place. But out here, the only references are the sun's position, the wind direction, the wave pattern, and the behavior of the water surface. Everything else is identical in all directions, just blue water meeting blue sky in a perfect circle around you. Your people have been making crossings like this for generations, maybe longer. Nobody knows exactly when the first person decided to go far enough from shore that land disappeared from view. It probably wasn't a decision at all. More likely it was an accident where someone fishing in deep water got pushed offshore by wind and current, lost sight of land, panicked for a while, then figured out how to get back and realized the experience was survivable. That person would have brought back knowledge that changed what was possible. Before their accident, the limit of exploration was wherever you could still see land. After their experience, the limit became wherever you could navigate using sky and water and whatever dead reckoning skills you could develop. The limit expanded suddenly from a few kilometers to potentially unlimited distance, though unlimited turns out to be less exciting than it sounds when you're sitting on a raft made of lashed logs, paddling toward an island you hope is still where you remember it being. The sun has fully risen now, positioned about 15 degrees above the eastern horizon, and climbing steadily. Its position gives you directional information that's more reliable than the wind, which can shift during the day as the land heats and cools. The sun's path across the sky follows a predictable arc that changes slightly with the seasons, but remains consistent enough for navigation, as long as you know what season you're in, and roughly what time of day it is. Knowing what time of day it is without a clock requires paying attention to how tired you feel, how hungry you are, how high the sun has climbed, how the light quality has changed, and how long it's been since various events that you can remember clearly. You left shore maybe 45 minutes ago, which you know because you can estimate how many paddle strokes you've taken, and you know roughly how long each stroke takes. You're not counting strokes consciously, that would be exhausting, but your body has an automatic sense of rhythm and duration that lets you feel how much time has passed. The raft is moving through water that's become noticeably different from the coastal water you left behind. The colour has shifted from greenish blue to darker blue, indicating deeper water with less suspended sediment. The waves have a longer period and smoother shape, coming from multiple directions and intersecting in patterns that create diamond-shaped areas of calm between the peaks. These are swell patterns created by winds blowing in different locations over the past several days, and reading them provides information about weather systems you can't see directly. One wave train is coming from almost due west, arriving in sets of 3 or 4 waves with smooth rounded peaks. These are long-period swells that have travelled a significant distance, probably generated by storms far out in the ocean 3 or 4 days ago. Another wave train is coming from the northwest, shorter period and steeper, probably from more recent wind closer to shore. The 2 wave trains intersect at an angle, creating areas where they reinforce each other and areas where they cancel out. You're steering to keep the reinforcement areas to your right side, which means you're angling slightly north of where you actually want to go. This seems counterintuitive until you account for the fact that the tidal current is still pushing you south, and by the time you reach the halfway point of your crossing, the current will have reversed and will start pushing you north. If you aim directly at your target, the south-pushing current in the morning will take you too far south, and then the north-pushing current in the afternoon won't have enough time to correct your position before you reach the island. So instead you aim north of your target in the morning, let the south pushing current bring you back toward the correct line, then aim south of your target in the afternoon and let the north pushing current bring you back again. The result is that you follow a gentle S-curve through the water, always being pushed away from your intended track but always paddling at an angle that compensates for the pushing. This compensation strategy requires knowing in advance how strong the current will be, which requires knowing how large the tidal range is today based on the phase of the moon, how far offshore you are, how the underwater topography channels and concentrates tidal flow, and probably a dozen other factors that you've internalized through experience. Getting it wrong means you arrive at the wrong part of the island, or miss the island entirely, and end up paddling into open ocean until you die of thirst or exhaustion. Your people don't have a perfect record with these crossings. Sometimes rafts don't come back. Sometimes you find wreckage on the beach weeks later. Sometimes people just disappear and you never know whether they died at sea or made landfall somewhere unexpected and decided to stay there, or got eaten by something large. The ocean is not a safe place, and pretending otherwise would be stupid. But it's also not as dangerous as it seems from the perspective of someone who's never spent time there. Most of the danger comes from ignorance, not knowing how to read conditions, not knowing when to turn back, not knowing what the normal patterns are so you can recognize when something abnormal is happening. If you pay attention and build up knowledge over many voyages and learn from people who survived their mistakes, the ocean becomes navigable. Not easy, but navigable. A bird appears off the right side of the raft, flying low over the water with steady wing beats. It's heading west, the same general direction you're travelling. You watch it for a few seconds, noting its behaviour. The bird is flying purposefully rather than hunting, which means it probably came from land behind you and is heading toward land ahead of you. Birds that are hunting fly erratically, constantly changing direction as they follow fish movements. Birds that are commuting between land areas fly in straight lines. This particular bird species, you'd recognise it as a shearwater if you knew that term, but you just think of it as the curved-winged seabird, regularly flies back and forth between mainland feeding areas and island nesting areas during certain seasons. Seeing one heading west at this time of day confirms that the island is still where you expect it to be, and that you're on a reasonable course to reach it. Later navigators are going to develop elaborate techniques for following birds to land, timing their departures to match when birds are returning to roost, understanding which bird species range how far from shore. The Polynesians will become particularly skilled at this. But right now you're just noting that a bird is heading the same direction you are, and that this is consistent with your expectations, and that consistency is reassuring when you're paddling across featureless water toward an island you can't see yet. The paddling rhythm has settled into something sustainable, fast enough to make progress but not so fast that anyone will be exhausted before the crossing is complete. Everyone is taking occasional breaks, rotating who's paddling hardest, and who's just maintaining enough stroke to keep the raft balanced. There's no formal system for this. People just naturally adjust their effort based on how tired they feel and how much energy they think they'll need later. You're starting to feel the sun's heat on your shoulders and back. The air temperature is rising as the morning progresses, and the combination of physical exertion and solar radiation is making you sweat despite the cool water occasionally splashing onto the raft when wave peaks pass beneath you. Staying hydrated is important, but you have limited water and you're trying not to drink too much too early. Thirst is going to become an issue during the afternoon regardless of how carefully you ration the water, so the strategy is to drink just enough to prevent serious impairment, but not so much that you run out before reaching the island. Modern humans would find this level of discomfort unacceptable, but you're used to physical discomfort as a normal part of existence. You're cold when the weather is cold. You're hot when the weather is hot. You're hungry between meals. You're thirsty when water isn't immediately available. You're tired after physical work. These aren't problems to be solved. They're just conditions that exist and that you tolerate while doing whatever needs to be done. The raft is roughly halfway to the island now, though you have no way to measure distance directly. You judge the halfway point by time elapsed, sun position, fatigue level, and a general sense of how these crossings normally feel at different stages. In another hour or so, you should start seeing the first hints of land ahead, a dark smudge on the western horizon that gradually resolves into identifiable features as you get closer. The dark smudge appears right on schedule, first as something you're not quite sure you're actually seeing, then as something definite but undetailed. The island is revealing itself the way islands always reveal themselves when approached from sea level. First the highest points, then gradually the lower elevations as you get close enough that they rise above the horizon. This island has a small volcanic hill at its centre, maybe 80 metres above sea level, and that hill is what you're seeing now. The beaches and lower coastal areas are still below the horizon from your perspective, which means you're still several kilometres away. But seeing any part of the island confirms that your navigation has been accurate enough to get you into the general vicinity, and now the final approach becomes much easier because you have a visible target to aim for. The current has reversed as expected. You can feel it pushing from the south now, trying to shove the raft northward while you paddle. The shift happened gradually over the past half hour as the tide slackened and then began rising again. The moment of slack tide was obvious in how the water surface behaved. Suddenly glacier, less organised, with wave trains from different directions creating confused patterns that resolved back into regular swells once the current established its new direction. You're compensating for the north-pushing current by angling your paddling slightly to the south, which feels awkward after spending all morning angling to the north. Your muscles have to adjust to the new paddling angle, and you can feel the strain in different parts of your shoulders and back. The person in front has taken a break and someone else has moved into that position, which changes the paddling rhythm slightly because each person has a different natural cadence. The island is growing larger, resolving into more detail. You can see the texture of vegetation on the volcanic hill now, darker patches that indicate trees or dense shrubs, contrasting with lighter patches of exposed rock or grassland. The summit of the hill has a distinctive notch on the southern side that you remember from previous visits. That notch provides a useful reference point for judging which side of the island you're approaching. Right now, the notch appears almost exactly in the centre of the visible portion of the island, which means you're approaching from almost due east, and should make landfall very close to the main beach, where previous trips have landed. This is good news because the alternative landing spots are less convenient, either rockier or facing directions that make them exposed to afternoon wind and waves. The afternoon wind is starting to pick up. You can feel it on your face, coming from the west now instead of the east where the morning wind came from. This is the normal pattern during this season: morning offshore wind from the land, afternoon onshore wind from the sea, with a period of calm in between when the wind shifts direction. The afternoon onshore wind is going to make the final approach more difficult because you'll be paddling into it, but it will also create a following sea that helps push the raft towards shore once you're close enough. Following sea is one of those navigation concepts that seems simple, but contains subtle dangers. Waves approaching from behind tend to lift the stern of your raft and accelerate you forward down the front of the wave, which feels helpful and efficient. But if the raft isn't aligned correctly with the wave direction, the stern lift becomes an uncontrolled surfing motion that can broach the raft sideways and potentially flip it. Preventing broaching requires constant attention to alignment and occasionally paddling hard to keep the raft moving fast enough that it stays directionally stable. The person steering from the back position, which is still you, has to develop an intuitive sense for when a wave is about to lift the stern and needs a correction, versus when the wave is small enough that it will just pass underneath without causing problems. This sense develops through repetition and mistakes. Early mistakes are exciting in the way that any near-death experience is exciting. Later mistakes become less frequent but more embarrassing, because you should know better by that point. You're close enough now to see the beach, a curved stretch of light-coloured sand between the water and the vegetation line. The beach is maybe a kilometre away, close enough that you could probably swim to it if the raft suddenly disintegrated. This proximity to safety changes the psychology of the situation. For the past several hours you've been in a state of sustained alertness, knowing that any major problem would likely be fatal. Now you're close enough that major problems would merely be unpleasant and exhausting rather than lethal. The relaxation that comes with proximity to safety is dangerous in its own way. More accidents happen during the last stage of a journey than during the middle portions because people stop paying attention at exactly the moment when local hazards become relevant. Rocks near shore, sudden changes in current, dumping waves in the surf zone, all of these require careful attention, but all of them tend to get overlooked by tired people who can see the beach and just want to be done with the whole expedition. You're forcing yourself to maintain the same level of attention you've held all day, scanning the water ahead for colour, changes that might indicate shallow rocks, watching the wave patterns for signs of complicated currents, checking the beach approach angle to make sure you're not heading for a section where steep offshore slopes create dangerous shore break. The beach looks uniform from this distance, but you know from previous visits that the southern end has better landing conditions than the northern end, where submerged rocks extend maybe 50 metres offshore. The afternoon sun is behind you now, casting your shadow and the raft's shadow onto the water in front. The shadow is distorted by wave motion, but clear enough that you can see the outline of the raft and the people paddling. Looking at your own shadow on the water creates an odd sense of detachment, as if you're observing yourself from outside. You're here on this raft in this ocean approaching this island, and also you're watching yourself do all of that, from some perspective that doesn't quite match your physical location. 3 hours from now you'll be standing on the beach watching the sun set over water you just crossed. The crossing will be complete and will join the other crossings in your memory as something that happened, something you survived, something that expanded your understanding of what's possible. The techniques you use today will be refined slightly and then passed on to the next generation, who will refine them further and pass them on again, a chain of transmitted knowledge that will eventually circle the entire Pacific Ocean and enable humans to inhabit every island that can support human life. But that's all future developments. Right now you're just tired and thirsty and ready to be done paddling. The beach is getting closer. You can see individual details now, driftwood logs above the high tide line, a cluster of dark rocks at the northern end, the way the vegetation grows down almost to the sand in the central section. The wave pattern is changing as the water depth decreases, becoming steeper and starting to break in lines parallel to the shore. The surf zone here is not particularly dangerous by ocean standards, but it still requires technique to navigate without being flipped broached. You're watching the sets of waves approaching from behind, timing the intervals between sets, looking for a lull when you can paddle hard through the braking zone and get the raft onto the beach before the next set arrives. Sets come in groups of 3 to 7 waves typically, with longer intervals between groups. The interval after a set is the window you need to exploit. A set just passed, the last wave of the group rolling under the raft and continuing towards shore where it's breaking in white water on the sand. The person in front is paddling hard now without needing to be told, and everyone else matches the increased rhythm. The raft accelerates forward, riding the back of the last wave in that set, staying just behind the braking zone but moving fast enough that you're gaining distance on the shore. The hull, calling it a hull is generous when it's just lashed logs, but the bottom surface of the raft touches sand briefly and then lifts free as another small wave passes underneath. You're in very shallow water now, almost at the point where you'll beach permanently. Another few paddle strokes and then everyone is sliding off into knee-deep water, grabbing the raft's edges, pulling it forward up the slope of the beach until it's far enough from the water that the next wave doesn't reach it. And just like that, the crossing is complete. You're standing on sand instead of on a raft. The ground is stable instead of constantly moving. The horizon is blocked by the island itself instead of being visible in all directions. Everything feels strange for a few minutes as your body adjusts to the absence of wave motion and the presence of solid earth. The island smells different from the mainland coast, saltier somehow, though that doesn't quite make sense since both places are right next to the ocean. Maybe it's not saltier but less muddy, less mixed with the smell of river mouths and coastal marshes that characterize the mainland shore. The vegetation here grows in what seems like purer salt air, tough plants adapted to wind and spray, with none of the transition zone species that populate the gradient between land and sea at mainland locations. You're here to collect shellfish, specifically a type of mussel that grows prolifically on rocks in the intertidal zone on the western side of the island. These mussels are larger and more abundant than the ones on the mainland, probably because the island's isolation means fewer predators and less competition from other shellfish collectors. The crossing is worth it economically even though it costs a full day of travel time, because you can gather in 4 hours what would take 2 weeks to accumulate on the mainland. But you're not gathering today. Today is for arrival, setting up a temporary camp above the beach, checking the raft for damage from the crossing, eating something, drinking water from the small stream that runs down from the island's interior, and generally recovering from the exhausting process of paddling 30 kilometers. Tomorrow morning you'll start gathering, working through the low tide period when the rocks are exposed and accessible. Tomorrow afternoon you'll begin processing the harvest, shucking the mussels, laying the meat out to dry in the sun and wind, preparing everything for transport. The day after tomorrow, if the weather looks favourable, you'll make the return crossing. If the weather looks questionable, you'll wait an extra day or two until conditions improve. Being stranded on the island is not particularly dangerous, There's fresh water and plenty of food if you're willing to gather it, but it extends the time away from the mainland where other responsibilities wait for attention. Your people practice a form of casual scheduling that modern humans would find frustrating. Things happen when conditions allow them to happen, and if conditions don't allow them to happen right away, you wait until they do. The temporary camp consists of nothing more than a depression scooped in the sand above the high tide line with some driftwood arranged to block wind from the most common directions. You're not building permanent structures. This island is a resource extraction location, not a residence. People come here for specific purposes and leave once those purposes are accomplished. The idea of living here permanently would seem strange. Why isolate yourself on an island when the mainland offers more diverse resources and easier access to the larger social group? Though actually, in a few thousand years, people will start living permanently on islands even smaller and more isolated than this one. The Pacific Island colonization process is going to push human settlement into some remarkably remote locations. But that's a different story involving longer sea voyages and different navigation techniques. Right now, you're just thinking about where to position yourself in the sand hollow, so you'll be comfortable enough to sleep tonight, despite having no bedding beyond the animal hide you're wearing. The sun is lower now, maybe 2 hours from setting. The light has that warm golden quality that happens in late afternoon, when the atmosphere scatters shorter wavelengths and lets the longer wavelengths through. The ocean surface looks different in this light, smoother somehow, with the wave texture de-emphasized and the overall colour shifted toward orange and red. The mainland is invisible from here, blocked by the curve of the earth, which creates an interesting psychological state where home is not just distant but literally impossible to see, no matter how clear the air or how carefully you look. Modern humans rarely experience complete visual separation from their origin point. Even when travelling long distances, you can usually see something that connects to where you started. Roads, trails, landmarks, GPS coordinates on a screen. But out here you're disconnected in a more absolute way. The only proof that the mainland exists is your memory of having been there and your confidence that you successfully navigated to this island, which implies the navigation techniques are accurate enough to reverse and get you back home. If you didn't trust those techniques completely, being out of sight of home would be terrifying. One of the other people in your group is building a small fire using driftwood collected from the upper beach. Starting fire without matches or lighters requires either friction-based techniques or striking sparks from stones, both of which take practice and patience. The friction technique your people use involves spinning a wooden stick against a wooden base until enough heat builds up to ignite fine plant fibres arranged around the friction point. The whole process takes maybe 5 minutes if you're skilled and conditions are good, or half an hour if the wood is slightly damp or the plant fibres aren't quite dry enough. Fire on the beach serves multiple purposes. It provides warmth as the air cools after sunset. It deters any animals that might be curious about the temporary human presence. It creates a social focal point where everyone naturally gathers, and it produces smoke that can be seen from long distances, which doesn't matter right now but might matter tomorrow if another group happens to be passing between the island and the mainland, and sees the smoke, and decides to stop by and share information about where resources are currently abundant. Information sharing is crucial in an economy based on hunting and gathering from dispersed locations. Knowing where fish are running, where shellfish beds are productive, where certain plants are ripening, where animal herds are moving, all of this information has immediate practical value, and all of it changes constantly. Your people don't have written communication or stored records, so information exists entirely in the network of social relationships and face-to-face conversations. Encountering another group by chance at a resource extraction site is an opportunity to update your mental model of where things are and what's happening across a much larger area than you can directly observe. The fire is going now, small flames working their way through the dry interior wood after catching on the surface splinters. Driftwood burns with distinctive colours sometimes, greens and blues and purples from salts absorbed during its time in the ocean. The person who built the fire is feeding it carefully, adding pieces sized to sustain the flame without smothering it, or making it too large. Fire management is one of those skills that seems simple until you try to do it with limited materials and no modern accelerants. You're sitting in the sand near the fire, feeling the heat on your face while the cooling evening air touches your back. The temperature contrast is pleasant in that specific way that only happens when you've been physically active all day and are now resting. Your muscles are tired, but not painfully so. Your hands are stiff from gripping the paddle for hours. Your lower back is letting you know that sitting in a fixed position on a raft all day is not an ergonomically optimal posture. But you're here, you're safe. You successfully navigated across open water to a predetermined destination using only observations of natural phenomena. The accomplishment doesn't feel dramatic because it's something you've been working toward for years and something your people have been doing for generations. But objectively, it represents a significant cognitive achievement, integrating multiple streams of sensory information into a working model of ocean dynamics accurate enough to predict where a 30-kilometre crossing will take you. Modern scientists are going to eventually study how people like you navigate without instruments. They're going to come up with terms like wayfinding and dead reckoning and environmental cognition. They're going to be impressed by how accurate traditional navigation techniques can be, and slightly puzzled by how difficult it is to learn those techniques in a laboratory setting versus learning them through direct experience over many years. Some of the scientists will argue that traditional navigation represents a fundamentally different cognitive system from modern instrument-based navigation. Others will argue that it's the same cognitive system applied to different inputs. You wouldn't care much about this academic debate if you knew it was going to happen. You'd probably think the question was obvious. Of course you're using your mind to figure out where you're going. What else would you be using? The fact that you're not using instruments just means you're paying attention to different things than people with instruments pay attention to. The underlying cognitive process of integrating information and building models and making predictions seems basically the same regardless of whether the input comes from water patterns or GPS satellites. The sun is setting now, dropping toward the western horizon where it will eventually disappear into the ocean in that way that looks dramatic but happens every single evening, and thus becomes routine despite its inherent beauty. The sky is doing the colour progression that happens at sunset. Yellow fading to orange, fading to red, fading to purple, with the deepest blue appearing in the eastern sky where night is already arriving. You can see the first bright stars appearing in the east, the same stars you'll use tomorrow evening if you make the return crossing. Morning arrives with the usual progression of light before sun, darkness giving way to twilight, giving way to the blue glow of civil twilight, giving way to the pink-orange of sunrise. You've been awake for perhaps half an hour, lying in the sand depression where you slept, watching the sky change while your body slowly transitions from unconscious to functional. Sleep without padding on sand is not particularly restful by modern standards, but it's the normal sleeping experience for you, and you wake feeling ready for the day's work. The tide is near its lowest point of the morning, which is exactly the time you plan to start gathering mussels. Low tide shifts later each day by about 50 minutes following the lunar cycle, and you time this expedition to align with morning low tides that would give you several hours of good collecting time before the tide rises and covers the rocks again. Tomorrow morning the low tide will be 50 minutes later, still early enough for a pre-departure gathering session, but getting close to the point where you'd have to adjust your travel schedule. The western side of the island is about a 15-minute walk from the beach where you landed. The path follows the shoreline for part of the way, and then cuts through interior vegetation to avoid a section of cliffs. The interior vegetation is dense, thorny shrubs and tough grasses that scratch exposed skin if you're not careful. The scratches aren't serious injuries, but they're annoying, and you've learned through experience which body positions minimize contact with the thorniest plants. The rock platform where the mussels grow extends maybe 30 meters from shore at low tide, creating a flat surface covered with tidal pools and exposed rock between the pools. The mussels cluster in areas that are submerged during high tide but exposed to air and sun during low tide. A harsh environment that excludes most competitors, but suits mussels perfectly. They attach to the rock with protein threads that are surprisingly strong, requiring deliberate effort with a stone tool to pry them loose. You're working methodically across the platform, collecting mussels and placing them in a basket woven from plant fibers. The basket is designed to drain water while retaining the mussels, and it's sized to hold about as much weight as you can comfortably carry back to the processing area near camp. A full basket probably weighs about 15 kilograms, which is heavy but manageable over short distances. The mussels come in various sizes. The largest ones are perhaps 8 centimeters long, thick-shelled and substantial. The smallest ones are barely 2 centimeters, hardly worth the effort of collecting. You're taking mostly the medium to large specimens, leaving the smallest ones to grow for future harvests. This isn't conscious conservation in the modern sense. You're not worried about sustainability as an abstract concept. You're just taking the specimens that offer the best return on effort, while leaving the less productive ones alone because spending time on them would be inefficient. Interestingly, this practical approach to harvesting creates a sustainable system, even though sustainability isn't the explicit goal. By taking larger specimens and leaving smaller ones, you're allowing the population to maintain itself across multiple generations. Modern fisheries managers are going to eventually codify this as a formal management strategy with size limits and catch quotas, but the underlying principle is ancient. Don't harvest everything immediately, or there won't be anything to harvest later. The tidal pools between the mussel clusters contain entire miniature ecosystems. Small fish, crabs, sea anemones, various types of algae, and creatures you don't have specific names for but recognize as either edible or inedible. The fish dart away when your shadow passes over the pool. The crabs retreat into crevices. The anemones retract their tentacles. Everything in the tidal zone is adapted to periodic disturbance and exposure, and everything has strategies for surviving until the next tide brings relief. You're crouched on the rocks, working steadily, occasionally straightening to stretch your back before returning to the harvesting position. The sun is climbing higher and starting to create genuine heat. The rock surface is warming, and the mussels in direct sun are going to start experiencing thermal stress if the low tide extends much longer. But the tide is already turning. You can see it in the patterns of water movement at the edge of the platform. The ocean is done retreating and has started its advance back toward shore. The basket is nearly full now, heavy with mussels whose combined weight represents a significant caloric harvest. These mussels will be processed today and tomorrow, dried until they can be transported without spoiling, then carried back to the mainland where they'll supplement other food sources through periods when gathering is less productive. The effort of making the crossing and spending 3 days on the island is justified by the sheer quantity of high-quality protein you're able to collect in one concentrated session. You're making your way back across the rocks towards shore, carrying the full basket. Watching your footing because wet rocks are slippery and falling with a heavy basket would be both painful and wasteful. The route requires scrambling over uneven surfaces, stepping between pools, occasionally jumping small gaps where channels cut through the rock platform. These movements are automatic at this point. Your body knows how to move across intertidal rocks the way a mountain goat knows how to move across steep slopes. The processing area near camp has been set up while you were gathering. Flat rocks arranged to provide a surface for shucking, a fire going to produce smoke that will help with preservation, space cleared for laying out the meat to dry. The other members of your group have already brought back baskets from their own gathering, and there's a substantial pile of mussels waiting to be processed. Shucking mussels is tedious work. You pry open each shell, remove the meat, discard the shell, place the meat in a growing pile. The shells go in a separate pile that will gradually accumulate over multiple visits and eventually become a permanent feature of this part of the island. A shell midden that archaeologists thousands of years in the future will excavate and analyse to learn about what people were eating and when and how processing techniques evolved. Your hands develop a rhythm. Grab mussel, insert stone blade at the seam, twist to pop it open, scoop out meat, toss shell. The rhythm becomes almost meditative after the first 100 repetitions. Your conscious mind drifts to other topics while your hands continue working automatically. You're thinking about the return crossing, about whether tomorrow's weather will cooperate, about what conditions to watch for tonight and in the morning that would indicate whether travel is advisable. The decision to cross or wait is never completely certain. You're always balancing risk against the benefits of returning home versus staying on the island longer. Tomorrow's wind could be stronger than expected. The current might be running at an unusual angle due to some oceanographic condition you can't predict. A sudden weather change could make the crossing dangerous despite having looked safe that morning. These uncertainties are part of ocean travel, and managing them requires judgment that comes from experience, and from having made enough crossings to calibrate your risk assessment against actual outcomes. Some crossings are obviously safe, light wind, clear sky, normal tidal patterns, calm seas. Some crossings are obviously dangerous, strong wind, deteriorating weather, unusual currents, large waves. But most crossings fall into an ambiguous middle category, where the conditions are acceptable but not ideal, and you have to decide whether acceptable is good enough. Getting this decision right most of the time is the difference between being known as a skilled navigator and being known as the person who died making an unnecessary crossing in marginal conditions. The pile of shucked muscle meat is growing. The meat is orange and grey, soft and slightly slimy, not particularly appetizing in its raw state, but nutritious and durable once dried. You're laying the pieces out on rocks positioned to get maximum sun exposure and air circulation, spacing them so they don't touch each other and can dry evenly. The smoke from the fire drifts across the drying racks, helping to discourage insects and adding a slight flavour that you've come to associate with preserved seafood. By late afternoon, the first batch of meat is already starting to shrink and firm up as moisture evaporates. By tomorrow afternoon, it will be dry enough to pack for transport. By the evening after that, if the crossing goes as planned, you'll be back on the mainland with several kilograms of preserved protein that required minimal effort compared to other food acquisition strategies available to your people. This efficiency is why island resource extraction makes sense despite the travel costs. The ocean is full of nutrients, and islands concentrate certain resources in ways that make them worth accessing, even when those islands are far enough from shore that reaching them requires navigating out of sight of land. Your people are developing a cultural knowledge base about which islands have which resources, and when those resources are accessible, and what conditions allow safe travel. This knowledge is being refined with each generation, and gradually enabling longer and more ambitious voyages. The decision about tomorrow's crossing gets made tonight, though it won't be formalised until morning when everyone can see the actual conditions rather than just predicting them. You're sitting near the fire again as darkness settles over the island, watching the way the flames create an isolated sphere of light surrounded by complete blackness in all directions. No light pollution exists in this world. When the sun is down and there's no moon, darkness is absolute except for stars and fire. The stars are spectacular tonight. Thousands of points of light scattered across the entire sky, with the dense band of the Milky Way running through the middle. You can see enough detail in the Milky Way to distinguish variations in brightness along its length. You can see individual bright stars and clusters, and what you'd know as planets, if you had the concept of planets distinct from stars. All of this celestial detail is providing information that you'll use tomorrow if you make the return crossing. Certain stars rise in the east at predictable times, and those rising positions mark directions that you can use for navigation. The star you used yesterday morning to orient your departure rose almost exactly in the east. Tonight a different star is rising slightly north of east, which means tomorrow morning if you orient toward where that star rose, you'll be heading slightly north of east, which is the approximate direction you need to go to return to the mainland, accounting for the current that will push you south during the first half of the crossing. This is getting complicated again, and explaining it in words makes it sound more difficult than it actually is when you're doing it. You're not calculating angles and directions intellectually. You're recognizing a pattern that you've observed many times before. When this particular star rises in this particular position relative to the horizon and other nearby stars, that rising position corresponds to the direction you need to paddle to successfully return home. The recognition is more like identifying a familiar face than like solving a geometry problem. The wind tonight is light and variable, which usually indicates a weather transition. The strong afternoon onshore wind died out around sunset, and now the air is moving gently without a consistent direction. This kind of calm typically precedes either continued good weather or a gradual deterioration over the next day or two. Reading which direction the weather will actually go requires paying attention to more subtle cues than just current wind speed. The cloud patterns earlier this evening showed some hints of organisation. High cirrus clouds forming into bands that stretched from southwest to northeast. Cirrus bands often indicate approaching weather systems, but the timing is uncertain. Weather could arrive tomorrow, or the day after, or not at all if the system tracks differently than the clouds suggest. You're mentally categorising tomorrow's crossing as probably safe but worth monitoring carefully in the morning before committing. One advantage of island crossings is that the commitment isn't absolute until you're far enough from shore that turning back becomes more dangerous than continuing forward. For the first hour or so of tomorrow's crossing, if conditions start deteriorating in ways you don't like, you can reverse course and return to the island to wait for better weather. This escape option makes marginal decisions less risky than they would be if you had to commit fully before starting. The fire is dying down to coals. Nobody is adding more wood because the night is warm enough that the heat isn't needed, and keeping a fire going requires effort that everyone would rather direct towards sleeping. The coals will stay warm until morning, making it easy to restart the fire if needed, But for now, the diminishing light creates a gradual transition toward complete darkness. Your eyes are adjusting to the darkness as the fire fades, becoming sensitive enough to see by starlight alone. The beach is visible as a lighter band between the dark vegetation and the dark ocean. The waves are audible but barely visible, just moving darkness against stationary darkness with occasional glints, where starlight reflects from wet surfaces. The sensory environment has shifted almost entirely to sound and touch, with vision reduced to vague shapes and movements. This is the world humans lived in for hundreds of thousands of years before artificial lighting changed the nighttime experience. Modern people rarely encounter true darkness. There's always some ambient light from cities or buildings or vehicles. But here in the darkness you can feel how different the human experience becomes when vision is nearly useless and other senses dominate. Sound becomes more important. Spatial memory becomes critical. Movement slows because you can't see obstacles clearly. You're settling into the sand depression for sleep, arranging your body position to minimize discomfort, using the animal hide as slight padding against the abrasive sand grains. Sleep comes more easily after a day of physical work than it does after a day of sedentary activity. Your body is tired in a wholesome way that modern humans rarely experience, unless they deliberately seek it out through exercise. The exhaustion isn't stressful, it's just the natural result of sustained effort, and sleep is the appropriate response. The sound of waves on the beach creates a rhythmic background that's almost hypnotic. The rhythm isn't perfectly regular. Wave intervals vary depending on how swell trains overlap, but it's consistent enough to create a pattern that your brain recognizes and finds soothing. Many humans find ocean sounds relaxing, probably because our evolutionary history includes extensive time living near coastlines, where these sounds indicated proximity to resources and relative safety from inland predators. Tomorrow will bring the return crossing if conditions allow, or another day on the island if they don't. Either way, you'll continue learning more about how the ocean behaves and how to read its patterns. Each crossing adds to your mental library of experiences, gradually building expertise that might seem instinctive, but is actually accumulated knowledge, organized by your brain into something that feels like intuition. The line between learned and instinctive blurs when you've been learning something since childhood through direct experience rather than formal instruction. Morning brings clear skies and light easterly wind, exactly the conditions you'd hope for when planning a return crossing. You're standing at the water's edge before sunrise, watching how the waves are breaking, checking the current by observing how floating debris moves, generally confirming that yesterday evening's assessment of the weather pattern was correct. Everything looks favourable for departure. The raft is already in the water, loaded with the dried mussel meat packed in baskets and wrapped in waterproof hides. The processing yesterday and early this morning produced perhaps 12 kilograms of dried product, split across 4 baskets that distribute weight evenly on the raft. This is a successful harvest by any measure, several weeks' worth of high-quality protein that required 3 days of effort to collect and process. The pre-departure routine is similar to the routine from 2 days ago, but reversed. Instead of checking the outbound conditions, you're checking the return conditions. Instead of orienting toward the rising star that marks the direction to the island, you're orienting toward the rising star that marks the direction back to the mainland. The techniques are the same, only the specific targets have changed. The tide is about 2 hours past high, falling steadily, which means the current will be pushing south during the early part of the crossing, exactly the opposite of what happened on the outbound journey. You'll need to compensate by aiming north of your intended track, letting the current bring you back toward the correct line as the morning progresses. Then in the afternoon, when the current reverses and starts pushing north, you'll aim south and let that current complete the correction. This explanation makes the process sound mechanical, as if you're just plugging variables into a formula. But the actual experience is more fluid. You're responding to what you feel and see in real time, making continuous small adjustments based on immediate sensory feedback. The overall strategy is planned, but the execution is improvisational within the constraints of that strategy. Launching through the surf zone is easier this morning than it was arriving 2 days ago, partly because you're already familiar with this beach, and partly because the surf is smaller. The swell has diminished slightly overnight, creating cleaner conditions with longer intervals between wave sets. You time the departure for a gap between sets, paddle hard through the shallow zone, and reach deep water without any dramatic moments. The island recedes behind you as you paddle east. The volcanic hill that was the first thing visible on approach is now the last thing visible on departure, shrinking gradually until it drops below the horizon, and you're once again surrounded by circular emptiness with sky above and water in all directions. The transition from seeing land to not seeing land happens smoothly enough that you don't notice the exact moment when the island disappears. The paddling rhythm settles into the same sustainable pace as before. Everyone knows this will be a long day of sustained effort, and nobody is wasting energy on unnecessary speed. The raft is moving forward at perhaps 4 or 5 kilometers per hour, a walking pace that feels slow but accumulates distance steadily. 30 kilometers at 5 kilometers per hour takes 6 hours of continuous movement, though the actual crossing will take longer because you're not moving in a perfectly straight line, and because breaks are necessary to prevent complete exhaustion. The sun is climbing in the eastern sky, positioned almost directly ahead of you, which makes the paddling uncomfortable because you're looking into brightness for hours at a stretch. You can't stare directly at the sun, but you need to maintain awareness of its position for navigational purposes, so you're constantly glancing toward it and then away, using peripheral vision to track its movement, while keeping your central vision directed toward the water surface, where you're actually looking for useful information. The water today is showing a different pattern than it did 2 days ago. The wave trains are coming from slightly different directions, and the colour is different, more greenish than blue, suggesting the presence of phytoplankton blooms that flourish when certain nutrient conditions exist. The greenish water isn't a problem for navigation, but it's notable because colour changes can indicate current patterns or water mass boundaries that might affect your crossing trajectory. A different bird appears this morning, not the curved-winged seabird from the outbound journey, but a smaller species that's flying in rapid darting patterns, suggesting it's actively hunting. This bird is not heading toward land, just foraging in the general area where you happen to be passing through. Its presence doesn't provide useful directional information, but it does confirm that you're in productive water where marine life is abundant enough to support hunting birds. The morning progresses without incident. You're maybe a third of the way across now, judging by time elapsed and fatigue level, and the vague sense of progress that comes from having made enough crossings to recognise what each stage feels like. The mainland is still invisible ahead, won't become visible for another hour or two at minimum. The island behind you has been invisible for a while. You're in the middle period of the crossing where both shores are over the horizon, and the only references are sky and water. This middle period is when navigation becomes most critical and most difficult. Without visible landmarks, you have to rely entirely on maintaining consistent heading, relative to sun position, wind direction, wave pattern, and whatever internal sense of direction humans possess. Some people are better at this than others. The same way some people are better at recognizing faces or remembering paths through forests. The skill seems partly learned and partly innate, though separating the two components is nearly impossible. Your heading feels correct. That's the best description available for the cognitive state you're in. The sun is where it should be relative to your paddling direction. The wind is hitting your face at the expected angle. The waves are coming from directions that match your mental model of how the swell patterns should intersect in this part of the ocean. Everything is consistent, which doesn't guarantee you're heading the right direction, but does confirm that you're maintaining a consistent direction, and that the direction matches your intended course as closely as you can determine without instruments. The current has reversed now, shifting from south pushing to north pushing as the tide transitions from falling to rising. You felt the change about 30 minutes ago when the water surface suddenly became glacier and the wave patterns briefly confused before reorganizing into new configurations. The transition through slack tide is always noticeable if you're paying attention, a moment of instability between two stable states. You're compensating for the north pushing current by adjusting your paddling angle slightly southward, and the adjustment is working. The sun's position relative to your heading is staying approximately constant even though the current is trying to push you off course. This dynamic balancing act between intentional steering and environmental forces is the core of traditional navigation, the skill that separates successful crossings from disasters. Something ahead catches your attention. A change in the water surface texture about 200 meters away, a line of rougher water that extends north and south as far as you can see. You're approaching a current boundary where two water masses with different characteristics meet and create visible surface features. The boundary is moving slowly westward, which means you're going to pass through it shortly. Crossing current boundaries can be tricky because the current speed and direction changes abruptly, potentially rotating the raft or accelerating it in unexpected ways. The solution is to approach the boundary at a slight angle rather than perpendicular, which reduces the rotational force and makes the transition smoother. You're adjusting your heading to achieve that angle, and you can see the person in front doing the same thing, everyone responding to the same visual cue without needing to discuss it verbally. The raft crosses the boundary with a small lurch as the current catches it and tries to push it sideways. Everyone corrects simultaneously, paddling harder on one side to prevent rotation, and then you're through and into the water mass on the far side where conditions are slightly different. Choppier surface, faster current, subtle shift in colour. The boundary marked the edge of the south-pushing current that was affecting you earlier. On this side, you're fully in the north-pushing current that will dominate the rest of the crossing. These current boundaries are reliable navigation features once you learn where they typically occur and how they behave at different tidal stages. The position shifts daily and seasonally, but the general pattern remains consistent enough that you can use boundaries as waypoints confirming you're on the expected track. Crossing this particular boundary at this time of day means you've travelled roughly the right distance at roughly the right angle, which is reassuring when you've been navigating by dead reckoning for several hours. The mainland should be appearing on the eastern horizon soon. You're watching for the first hints of land, a darkness that's slightly more solid than the haze, a consistency to a feature that doesn't move or shimmer the way atmospheric distortions do. The appearance of land after hours of seeing nothing but water and sky is always satisfying, a confirmation that your navigation was accurate and that you're going to complete the crossing successfully. There it is, a dark smudge at the horizon that gradually resolves into the familiar outline of the coastal cliffs you left 3 days ago. The sight creates a small emotional lift, not dramatic but noticeable, a release of tension you didn't fully realise you were carrying. The crossing is essentially complete now, even though you're still several kilometres from shore. Barring some catastrophic equipment failure, you're going to make it. The final approach is going to be easier than it was arriving at the island because you're approaching from the west with the afternoon wind behind you, instead of having to paddle into onshore wind. The following sea is already helping push the raft eastward, reducing the paddling effort required to maintain forward speed. This is one advantage of the round-trip pattern you're using. The prevailing winds and currents generally oppose you in one direction, but assist you in the other, creating a natural balance that makes both legs of the journey possible with reasonable effort. The coastline is resolving into detail now. You can see specific features: the rock outcrop where you sat watching water patterns before the outbound crossing, the area where the river mouth creates the freshwater plume, the cluster of shelters farther inland. All of these familiar landmarks are confirming that you've navigated to exactly the right section of coast, not just to some random point along hundreds of kilometres of similar-looking shoreline. This precision is what makes traditional navigation effective. You're not just finding land, you're finding specific locations within large coastal areas, hitting targets that are small enough to be genuinely useful. Modern navigation with GPS coordinates is more accurate in terms of absolute positioning, but the practical difference between landing at your intended beach versus landing 5 kilometres away is the same, regardless of whether you navigated with satellites or with water patterns. The surf zone approaches. You're reading the wave patterns like you did at the island, looking for a set gap that will let you paddle through the braking zone before the next set arrives. The timing works out well. A long lull opens up just as you're reaching the outer edge of the surf, and everyone paddles hard to exploit the opportunity. The raft surfs briefly on the back of a small wave, accelerates towards shore, touches sand, and then you're all sliding off into shallow water and pulling the raft up the beach to safety. The crossing is complete. You've successfully travelled across open water to a predetermined destination and returned, a round trip of 60 kilometres with no instruments and no navigation aids beyond observation and memory. Modern people would find this accomplishment remarkable. You find it normal, just the way you acquire resources that happen to be located on an island rather than on the mainland. Sitting on the same limestone outcrop where this story started, you're watching the water again in the late afternoon light. The crossing was 3 days ago, but the observations continue. They never stop actually. Every time you're near the ocean, you're watching how it behaves, adding small incremental updates to your mental model of tides and currents and wave patterns. The freshwater plume from the river mouth is behaving normally today. The line where currents meet is in its expected position for this point in the tidal cycle and moon phase. The wind is shifting from east to west as the afternoon progresses, Everything is proceeding according to the patterns you've learned over years of observation, the reliable rhythm of natural processes that repeat with variations but never deviate so far from the average that the patterns become unrecognizable. These patterns are what make navigation possible without instruments. The ocean is not random chaos. It's organized by consistent forces: lunar gravity, solar heating, planetary rotation, atmospheric pressure, continental topography. These forces create patterns that recur predictably enough that observers can learn them and use them for practical purposes like crossing open water without drowning. Your descendants are going to expand on these techniques. They're going to develop more sophisticated methods for reading ocean conditions, more elaborate mental frameworks for organizing navigational knowledge, more ambitious voyage plans that push farther and farther from shore. Within a few thousand years, people descended from your cultural group will be crossing ocean basins that are thousands of kilometers wide, navigating to tiny islands that are nearly impossible to find without extremely accurate directional information. The Pacific Islanders will become particularly skilled at this. They'll develop techniques for following bird migrations, reading deep ocean swells that reveal the presence of distant islands, using star paths that mark consistent directions across different latitudes. They'll build ocean-going canoes that are vastly more capable than your simple raft. They'll create knowledge systems that encode navigational information in charts and stories, and physical artifacts that can be transmitted accurately across generations. But all of that begins here with you sitting on a rock, watching how water moves and learning to predict what the movements mean. The sophisticated navigation systems of the future are built on exactly these observations, nothing more mysterious than careful attention to natural phenomena combined with good memory and the patience to accumulate knowledge slowly over many repetitions. Modern researchers are going to rediscover how accurate traditional navigation methods can be, though the rediscovery will take a while. For most of the modern period, Western scientists will assume that long-distance ocean navigation without instruments must have been mostly luck combined with crude approximations. The idea that traditional navigators could pinpoint small islands across thousands of kilometers of open water will seem implausible to people who've grown dependent on GPS and electronic charts. But then researchers will start working with traditional navigators who still practice the old methods, and they'll discover that the accuracy is real. Traditional navigators can indeed find tiny islands in vast oceans. They do it by reading wave patterns that reveal the presence of land over the horizon, by following bird migrations that connect food sources with nesting sites, by tracking star paths that remain constant even as the Earth rotates. The techniques work, and they work reliably enough that entire ocean basins were populated using nothing more advanced than the observations you're making right now while sitting on a rock watching water. The sun is setting again. You've watched it set thousands of times, and each sunset adds a tiny bit of information to your understanding of how atmospheric conditions affect light and visibility. You know that clear sunsets with sharp horizons predict continued good weather. You know that hazy sunsets with diffuse horizons often precede weather changes. You know that certain colours in the sunset sky correlate with certain types of clouds at high altitude, which correlate with certain weather patterns arriving within the next day or two. This knowledge isn't mystical or supernatural. It's observational meteorology developed through repetition. The same information is available to anyone who watches enough sunsets in enough different weather conditions to recognise the patterns. Modern meteorologists have codified some of these patterns into formal forecasting rules. Red sky at night indicates high pressure systems, for example. But the underlying observations are ancient. You're going to make many more island crossings in your life, weather permitting and assuming you don't make a fatal navigational error. Each crossing will be slightly different wind patterns, different current conditions, different wave characteristics. But all of them will be variations on the same basic theme of using environmental observations to travel between predetermined locations. The skill will improve gradually as you accumulate more experience and learn to recognize increasingly subtle cues, and then eventually you'll teach these techniques to younger people who are just beginning to learn how the ocean behaves. You'll bring them to this same outcrop and show them how to read the freshwater plume. You'll take them on crossings and let them practice maintaining heading when land isn't visible. You'll gradually transfer your accumulated knowledge to the next generation, which will transfer it to the generation after that, an unbroken chain of transmitted information stretching forward into the future for thousands of years. Some of that information will be lost or distorted as it passes through generations. Some of it will be improved as new observers discover additional patterns, but the core techniques, reading water, reading sky, reading birds, maintaining dead reckoning, compensating for currents, will persist because they work, and things that work tend to be preserved even when the specific cultural context changes. The Polynesians, who eventually navigate across the entire Pacific, will be using techniques that connect directly back to observations like yours. They'll have elaborated and refined those techniques, adding layers of sophistication that won't exist for thousands of years yet. But the fundamental approach will be the same. Pay careful attention to how the ocean behaves, remember what you observe, use that accumulated knowledge to predict where you'll end up if you travel in a particular direction for a particular duration. This is navigation before it became a science, before anyone thought of it as a separate discipline with specialized knowledge and trained experts. Right now, it's just part of how you interact with the ocean, no more remarkable than knowing which plants are edible or which animals are dangerous. The ocean is simply another environment that humans are learning to move through safely, and the learning process involves the same basic cognitive tools humans use for everything else: observation, memory, pattern recognition, prediction, and the willingness to occasionally be wrong and learn from the error. The last light is fading from the western sky. The ocean is turning dark, visible now only as a moving shadow against the slightly less dark sky. Stars are appearing one by one as the darkness deepens. The same stars you've used for navigation are simply points of light in the darkness now, familiar patterns that mark direction and season and time of night without requiring conscious analysis. You know them the way you know the faces of your family members, instantly recognizable, deeply familiar, requiring no effort to identify. Tomorrow there will be other tasks: repairing the raft's lashings, gathering different resources from different locations, maintaining the social relationships that hold your group together, living the normal daily life of someone in a small-scale society that survives by knowing its environment intimately and using that knowledge skillfully. But the ocean will still be there, moving in its patterned ways, and you'll still be watching it whenever you have the chance. The observations never really stop. They're just part of how you see the world, part of the perpetual process of learning that continues throughout your entire life. You'll die eventually, everyone does, but the knowledge you've accumulated will persist in the people you taught, and their knowledge will persist in the people they teach, and the chain will continue until perhaps someday someone sits on a similar rock on a distant shore they reached, by using techniques that connect back to yours through generations of transmitted understanding. The ocean before navigation became a science wasn't actually much different from the ocean after navigation became a science. The water moved the same way. The tides followed the same lunar rhythms. The currents flowed in the same patterns. What changed was how humans thought about these phenomena, whether they were mysterious forces to be respectfully observed or quantifiable variables to be measured and calculated. But the observing and calculating are fundamentally the same cognitive process. You're just doing it without instruments, without formal models, without the elaborate theoretical framework that will eventually be built on top of exactly the kind of empirical knowledge you're accumulating through direct experience. You're navigating by noticing how things actually behave rather than by predicting how theory says they should behave. And that direct empirical approach turns out to be remarkably effective when the observer is skilled and patient and willing to learn from mistakes. The darkness is nearly complete now. You can barely see the water surface anymore, but you can hear it moving, the constant rhythm of waves on rocks, and you know from sound alone roughly what the tide is doing and what the wind is doing and what the wave period is. You can navigate by sound if necessary, though it's less reliable than navigating by sight. Everything is less reliable at night, which is why most travelling happens during daylight when visibility maximises the information available for decision-making. You stand up from the limestone outcrop for the final time in this story. Your legs are stiff from sitting still. You stretch, working the stiffness out, and begin walking back toward the shelters where you'll sleep tonight and wake tomorrow to whatever tasks the day brings. The ocean will still be there tomorrow. It's always there, moving in its endless patterns, waiting for anyone patient enough to learn its language and skilled enough to use that knowledge for travelling safely between distant shores. Long before anyone counted seconds or checked a wrist for the hour, people lived inside time rather than measured it. The sun rose, shadows stretched and shrank, and seasons turn the world from green to gold to white and back again. Tonight, you're going back to when time was something you felt in your bones, read in the sky, and trusted to the rhythms that pulse through everything alive. You wake before dawn in a world that has no numbers for what happens next. There's no alarm screaming from a nightstand, no glowing digits announcing that you're late or early or exactly on schedule. You wake because your body knows. The air has changed. The birds have started their racket in the trees outside your dwelling, whatever form that dwelling takes, whether it's hide stretched over poles, mud bricks stacked and dried, or stone fitted together with the patience of generations. Your eyes open to darkness that's not quite as dark as it was an hour ago. You can't say an hour ago because hours don't exist yet, but you know the difference between deep night and the softening that comes before dawn. You've known it your whole life. Your grandparents knew it. Everyone you've ever met knows it. The darkness has texture, and you read it the way someone in a future time will glance at a screen. You don't leap up. There's no rushing because there's nothing to be late for in the way lateness will eventually be understood. You rise when your body says you've rested enough, when the light says it's time to see, and when the work ahead becomes more pressing than the comfort of staying horizontal. Maybe you're a farmer in ancient Mesopotamia, sleeping on a reed mat in a one-room house that smells like bread and lamp oil. Maybe you're a hunter in northern Europe, wrapped in furs in a longhouse where 20 other people are starting to stir, coughing and murmuring and rebuilding the fire that's burned down to embers. You step outside, and the sky is doing what it always does, performing the most reliable show in existence. In the east, the horizon is turning from black to deep blue to a blue that's almost purple, and you don't need anyone to tell you that the sun will be up soon. You've seen this happen thousands of times. You could probably predict within the span of a few breaths exactly when that first bright edge will appear, but you don't think of it as a prediction. You think of it as knowing, the same way you know that stones are hard and water is wet. The rooster, if you have one, starts screaming its head off right on schedule. Roosters are excellent timekeepers, which is both useful and deeply annoying. If you don't have a rooster, you have some other marker, the particular bird that always sings first, the way the neighbour's dog starts barking, the smell of someone else's fire already burning, because there's always someone who wakes before you, someone whose rhythms run a little faster. You look at the sky, because the sky's the closest thing you have to a universal reference point. Everyone everywhere can see it, assuming it's not cloudy, and even when it's cloudy, you know it's still up there doing its thing. The sun is the obvious star of this show, but it's not the only performer. You've been watching the moon your entire life, watching it swell and shrink, disappear and return, and tracking its journey across the darkness. You know without anyone teaching you, because everyone teaches you just by living, that the moon's changes match up with other cycles. Women's bodies follow the moon, roughly. Tides follow the moon, if you live anywhere near the ocean. Even some animals seem to coordinate their behaviour with lunar phases, though you might not think of it in those terms. You just notice that certain fish show up when the moon is fat, or that the hunting is better in the dark of the moon, when prey can't see you coming. Someone in your community is probably the designated sky watcher, the person who pays closer attention than most, who notices patterns that others miss. Maybe it's an elder who's had decades to observe. Maybe it's a priest or priestess whose job involves knowing when to hold ceremonies. Maybe it's just someone who's naturally curious and spends their evenings staring upward instead of collapsing into sleep. This person knows things. They know that certain stars appear at certain times of the year. They know that the sun doesn't rise in the exact same spot every morning. It shifts along the horizon, creeping north, creeping south, marking the seasons more accurately than any calendar. They know that if you watch the same star over the course of a year, it will seem to move through the sky in a predictable pattern, rising earlier, setting later, disappearing for a while, then coming back. You don't know the word astronomy, because that word won't be invented for thousands of years. But you're doing astronomy. You're doing it with your naked eyes, and your memory, and your willingness to pay attention to the same things night after night, year after year, generation after generation. The sun breaks the horizon, and you don't check anything to confirm this. You don't look at a device. You just notice that the world is suddenly touched with gold, that the shadows are being born, and that the temperature is about to start rising. You have work to do, and the sun has just told you to begin. By the time the sun is fully up, you're already doing something. Feeding animals, grinding grain, checking traps, nursing a baby, sharpening tools, and starting a fire if you let yours go out overnight. The morning has a particular quality of light and energy. Things feel possible. The heat hasn't built up yet if you're in a warm climate. The cold hasn't deepened if you're somewhere winter is brutal. You're not alone in whatever you're doing. Other people are moving through their own routines, and you can hear them. Voices calling to each other, animals making their various noises, the sound of work beginning, tools striking, gates opening, water being drawn from wherever you keep it. Someone has probably already noticed that the shadows are getting shorter. If you live in a community that's developed even the simplest time awareness, you might have a stick or a stone or a post planted in the ground specifically for shadow watching. It's not a sundial yet, not in any formal sense, but it's the ancestor of a sundial. It's a thing that stands still while its shadow moves, and that movement tells you something. In ancient Egypt, someone figured out you could mark the shadow's length at different times and create a reference system. You could say, when the shadow reaches this mark, it's time to stop working and eat. You could say, when the shadow's at its shortest, the day is half done. You couldn't say noon because that word didn't exist yet, but you could understand the concept. The sun reaches its highest point, the shadow shrinks to almost nothing. Then everything reverses. If you're working in a field, you probably don't have an official shadow stick, but you have your own body. You can see your shadow stretching out in front of you in the early morning, a long dark companion that mimics everything you do. By mid-morning it's shorter. By the time your stomach starts demanding food, your shadow has become a small puddle at your feet. This is useful information. Your shadow tells you whether you have time to finish something before the heat becomes unbearable. It tells you whether you should head back home or push forward to the next task. It tells you, roughly, how much daylight you have left to work with. The Babylonians got fancy with this. They created actual devices, early sundials that divided the day into 12 parts. They picked 12 because they like that number. It divides nicely, and their whole mathematical system was based on sets of 60 and 12. But that's relatively advanced. For most of human history, shadow reading was simpler and more intuitive. You just knew that long shadows meant early or late. Short shadows meant middle. No shadow at all. That weird moment when the sun is directly overhead meant you were living close to the equator, and it was the right time of year, and you should probably find some shade because that sun was not playing around. In northern climates, shadows acted differently. In summer they were short and fleeting. In winter they stretched impossibly long, and the sun barely seemed to climb above the horizon before it started sinking again. You couldn't rely on shadows the same way someone in Egypt or Mesopotamia could, but you could still use them. You could still notice that the quality of light at a particular shadow length meant it was time to bring the animals in, time to start preparing the evening meal, and time to gather the children before dark. Shadows were patient teachers. They didn't rush. They moved at exactly the speed the earth was turning, which is to say they moved imperceptibly in any given moment, but obviously over the span of time you could measure in breaths and tasks. You could watch your shadow while you worked and it would be in the same place. Then you'd get absorbed in what you were doing, and when you looked again, it had shifted. The world had turned. Time had passed, whether you noticed it or not. Some communities built entire structures around shadow watching. At Stonehenge, though you're not necessarily at Stonehenge, you're just aware that this kind of thing happened. Massive stones were arranged to catch the sun at specific moments. On the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the sun would rise in perfect alignment with certain stones, and the shadow it cast would fall in a meaningful direction. This wasn't about telling time in the sense of knowing whether it was 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. This was about marking the extreme points of the sun's yearly journey. This was about saying, the sun has gone as far north as it's going to go. From here on out, the days will get shorter. You probably didn't build Stonehenge yourself, but you understood the principle. The sun moves, shadows follow. If you pay attention, you can use this to organise your life. By late afternoon, your shadow is stretching out again, this time in the opposite direction. The light has changed quality. It's golden now, softer, angled. The air might be cooling down, or it might be holding on to heat depending on the season and the landscape. But you know from the shadows that the day is winding down. You start thinking about evening tasks. You start moving toward home, or toward wherever you'll spend the night. The shadows tell you all of this without saying a word, which is good because shadows are notoriously quiet. You know it's autumn because your body is telling you to eat more. There's a biological imperative kicking in, an ancient instruction that says winter is coming and you need to put on some padding. You're hungrier than you were a month ago. You're drawn to the foods that are ripening now. Nuts, late fruits, anything rich and fatty. You also know it's autumn because the air smells different. There's a sharpness to it, a clarity that wasn't there in the thick heat of summer. When you wake up, there might be heavy dew on the grass or frost if you're far enough into the season. The leaves are changing if you're in a place that has deciduous trees. The birds are acting strange, gathering in large flocks, having loud conferences about their upcoming travel plans. You don't call it autumn, you might call it harvest time, or the time when things die back, or the season of gathering. Different cultures had different names and different numbers of seasons. Some places recognised 4, some recognised 6 or more, some divided the year into dry season and wet season, and that was all the distinction necessary. But regardless of what you called it, you felt it. These seasons weren't abstract concepts. They were physical realities that changed everything about your daily existence. In spring, the world woke up. The ground softened. Things started growing. If you were a farmer, this was the busiest time, the planting time, the time when you worked until your back screamed and your hands bled because if you didn't get seeds in the ground now, you wouldn't eat later. The light was increasing. The days were getting longer. You could feel the world tilting toward the sun, though you didn't necessarily think of it that way. You just knew that winter's grip was loosening. Summer meant heat and light and long days of work. Depending on where you lived, summer could be glorious or brutal. In Northern Europe, summer was the good time, the time when you could actually be outside without freezing, when things grew like crazy, when the sun barely set and you could work until you dropped. In the Middle East or North Africa, summer was something to survive, the time when you worked in the early morning and late evening, and hid from the sun during the middle of the day. Winter was the time when everything slowed down. The earth was hard. The plants were dormant or dead. If you'd prepared properly, you had stores of food, grain in jars, dried meat, preserved fruits, and roots buried in sand. If you hadn't prepared properly, you would have been in trouble. Winter was when people died. The very young, the very old, the sick, and the unlucky. Winter didn't care about your plans, but winter was also quiet time, story time, and craft time. When you couldn't work the fields, you worked on other things. You repaired tools, you made clothes. You told the long stories that held your culture together, the ones about where you came from and why things are the way they are. You measured your life in these cycles. You might say, I've seen 20 winters, meaning you were 20 years old, though you probably didn't count that precisely. You might say, we'll do that after the next harvest, meaning in roughly a year. You might say, she was born in the time of high water, and everyone would know what you meant because the river flooded every year at the same time. In Egypt, the entire calendar was based on the Nile's flooding. The year had 3 seasons: inundation, growth, and harvest. When the river flooded, that was the new year, the reset button, the moment when the world began again. You could set your calendar by the flood, and people did for thousands of years. In other places, the calendar reset at different moments. The winter solstice was popular, the shortest day, the day when the sun stopped its southward retreat and began coming back. That was a moment worth celebrating. It meant you'd survived the worst of winter, that light was returning, and that life would continue. You knew the solstices not because someone told you the date, but because you felt them. The day length had been changing for months, and you'd been noticing. You'd watch the sunrise point shift along the horizon. You'd watch the sunset point do the same, and then, suddenly they stopped. For a few days the sun rose and set in the same places, then it turned around and started moving in the other direction. That turning point was sacred to many cultures. It was a moment when the cosmic order was reasserting itself, when the sun was being reborn, when you could trust that the patterns would continue. The equinoxes were important too. The two moments each year when day and night were of equal length, when the balance was perfect. Spring equinox meant the growing season was truly beginning. The autumn equinox meant winter was on its way. You probably didn't calculate these moments with mathematical precision, but you knew when they were happening. You could feel the balance shift. You could sense when the light had reached its maximum or minimum, when things were about to change direction. And all of this happened without anyone checking a calendar, without anyone needing to know that it was March 20th or September 22nd. The earth kept turning, the seasons kept cycling. You kept paying attention. You're hungry before you decide to be hungry. Your stomach starts making those gurgling sounds. That empty feeling spreads through your middle, and your thoughts start drifting toward food. This happens at roughly the same times every day because your body has an internal clock, and it's been keeping time since before your species learned to walk upright. Ancient people didn't know about circadian rhythms, but they lived them. They knew that certain things happened at certain times without any external prompting. You got tired when the sun went down. You woke when it came up. You got hungry at predictable intervals. Your body temperature fluctuated throughout the day and night. All of this was timekeeping of a sort. Biological timekeeping that happened whether you paid attention to it or not. If you were a woman of childbearing age, you had another clock running, the menstrual cycle, roughly lunar in its length, though not exactly sync to the moon, despite what many people believed. This was a deeply personal timekeeper, one that told you when to expect bleeding, when you might become pregnant, and when your mood might shift in predictable directions. Pregnancy was its own kind of calendar, 10 lunar months from conception to birth, give or take. You could feel the progression. The quickening, that first flutter of movement, happened at a predictable point. The swelling of your belly followed a timeline. Your body was counting down to something momentous, and it let you know where you were in the process. Even sleep had its patterns. You didn't sleep in one long block the way modern people try to. You had first sleep and second sleep, with a wakeful period in the middle of the night. This wasn't insomnia. This was normal. You'd sleep for a few hours after dark, then wake up naturally. You'd lie there in the darkness, thinking, talking quietly if there was someone next to you, maybe getting up to pee or check on the animals or feed the fire. Then you'd drift back into second sleep, which would carry you until dawn. Historians have found references to this pattern in old texts, in legal documents that mention things happening during the wakeful period, and in literature that describes characters' activities between first and second sleep. This was how humans slept for most of history, before artificial light made it possible to stay up late and then crash for 8 hours straight. Your daily rhythms extended beyond your own body. You lived in a community, and the community had rhythms. Someone woke first and started the day. Someone else stayed up latest and banked the fires. Children had their own schedule, which involved maximum energy at times that were inconvenient for exhausted adults. Old people's rhythms might be different, their sleep lighter, and their waking hours adjusted to bodies that didn't work quite as efficiently as they used to. Animals added their own temporal markers. The rooster crowed at dawn, yes, but also sometimes at 2 in the morning for reasons known only to the rooster. Cows needed milking at roughly the same times each day, and they'd let you know if you were late. Dogs barked when strangers approached, which happened more often at certain times. Nocturnal animals started their rustling and hunting when the sun went down, creating a whole different soundscape after dark. The work itself had a rhythm. Morning work was different from afternoon work. You did the tasks that required clear thinking and good light early. You saved the repetitive stuff for when you were tired. You knew how long things took, not in minutes, but in the feeling of doing them. Grinding enough grain for bread took the length of time it took, and you knew that length in your muscles and bones. Threshing grain had a rhythm you could hear, the regular beat of flails hitting the stalks, the sound of many people working together in a pattern that was almost musical. Weaving had a rhythm, the shuttle passing back and forth, the loom creaking. Even walking had a rhythm that measured distance and time. You knew how many days it took to walk to the next village, and you knew it precisely because you'd done it many times. Sacred time overlaid daily time. There were moments in the day when you were supposed to pray or make offerings, and these moments were marked by natural phenomena. Dawn and dusk were obvious times, threshold moments when the world was changing states. Noon was significant in many traditions, the sun at its height, the moment of maximum light and power. Some cultures prayed 5 times a day, and they determined when to pray by watching the shadows and the position of the sun. The first prayer came at dawn. The second was when the sun was at its height. The third was in the afternoon when shadows were a certain length. The fourth at sunset. The fifth after full darkness had fallen. You didn't need a clock for any of this. You needed eyes and attention and a willingness to participate in the rhythms that surrounded you. Your body was keeping time. The sun was keeping time. The community was keeping time. You were all synchronized to each other and to the turning of the earth, and that was enough. You remember the year of the Great Flood not because someone wrote it down as 2034 BCE, but because you remember the water reaching the top step of the temple, the way everyone had to evacuate to higher ground, and the family whose baby was born on the roof where they'd taken shelter. That's the year of the Great Flood, and everything before and after it gets measured in relation to that event. You remember the winter your grandmother died, the summer when locusts ate half the crops, and the spring when your brother fell out of a tree and broke his arm. These are your temporal landmarks, the stakes you drive into the ground of time to keep everything organised. Every culture did this. Every community had its memorable events that served as reference points. Natural disasters were popular markers: earthquakes, floods, droughts, and volcanic eruptions. So were political upheavals, the year a new king was crowned, the year invaders came, and the year of the big war. Personal milestones worked too: births, deaths, marriages, and initiations into adulthood. Instead of saying 5 years ago, you might say the year before the drought, and everyone would know what you meant. Instead of saying next month, you might say after the moon has filled and emptied again. Some societies formalize this memory keeping into king lists and year names. In ancient Mesopotamia, each year was named after a significant event. The year might be called the year King Hammurabi dug the canal, or the year of the great harvest. This created a linear timeline of sorts, a way to keep track of when things happened relative to other things, but for most people memory was less formal and more personal. You kept track of your own life and your family's lives using whatever markers made sense to you. You knew how old you were in a general sense. You'd seen a certain number of winters and passed through certain life stages. You might not know your exact birth date, but you knew the season you were born and maybe the phase of the moon. Children's ages were measured in capabilities rather than years. A child wasn't 5 years old. A child was old enough to help with the animals, or too young to be left alone, or ready to learn a craft. These were functional categories that mattered more than the passage of time in some abstract numerical sense. Elders carried the deep memory, the stories that went back multiple generations. Your grandfather could tell you about his grandfather, and his grandfather could have told him about his grandfather, creating a chain of memory that stretched back 100 years or more. These stories weren't precisely dated, but they preserved important information. where the community came from, what disasters they'd survived, what worked and what didn't. Oral history is tricky because it changes with each telling. Details shift, events get compressed or expanded. The story of something that happened over several years might be remembered as a single dramatic event, but the core truth often remained intact, enough to pass on crucial knowledge about flood patterns, hunting grounds, plant locations and enemy movements. Some cultures developed more elaborate memory systems. The Inca used quipu, knotted strings in different colours, to record numerical information and possibly historical events. Different types of knots meant different things. The position of knots on the string carried meaning. It was a three-dimensional way of storing information, a calendar and a counting system all in one. Australian Aboriginal cultures used the landscape itself as a memory aid. Particular rocks, trees, waterholes and landforms were associated with specific stories. Walking through the landscape was like reading a book, each feature triggering the next part of the narrative. This created a spatial calendar, a way of organising time and events in relationship to place. You didn't need to remember everything, of course. You just needed to remember enough to function, enough to pass on essential knowledge, and enough to maintain continuity with the past. And you did this through repetition, through stories told over and over, and through seasonal activities that reinforced themselves year after year. The harvest happened every year, and you remembered how to do it because you'd done it many times before. The sacred ceremonies happened at regular intervals, and you remembered them through participation. The skills you needed to survive were encoded in muscle memory and habit, in knowledge passed down so smoothly you barely noticed you were learning it. Time wasn't something external to you that you had to track with tools. Time was the medium you lived in, and memory was how you navigated it. You're lying on your back in the darkness, looking up at more stars than anyone in the modern world can imagine seeing. There are no city lights to wash them out, no street lamps, and no illuminated signs. When the moon is down and the sky is clear, the stars are so dense they look like spilled milk, like someone scattered diamonds across black cloth. You know these stars. You've been watching them your whole life, and people have been watching them for thousands of years before you were born. You know their patterns, their movements, and their meanings. That bright cluster there, the one that looks like a tiny dipper or a small gathering of jewels. Different cultures called it different things, but you know it. The Greeks would call it the Pleiades, other cultures called it the Seven Sisters. You might have a completely different name for it, but you know it matters because it appears at certain times of year and disappears at others. When those stars rise just before dawn, it might be time to plant. When they set with the sun, it might be time to harvest. When you can't see them at all, you're in a particular season, and you know what to expect from the weather and the world. The Egyptians watched Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. They called it Sopdet, and when it rose just before the sun after a period of invisibility, that meant the Nile was about to flood. This happened with such regularity that they based their entire calendar on it. The rising of Sirius marked the new year, the moment when everything reset. Different stars mattered to different people depending on where they lived and what they needed to know. If you were a sailor or a nomad crossing empty landscapes, stars were your navigation system. Certain stars stayed in the same place, or seemed to. The North Star in the Northern Hemisphere, barely moving while everything else wheeled around it, was a fixed point you could orient yourself by. You learned constellations not as arbitrary dot-to-dot pictures, but as memory aids, as ways to organise the chaos of the night sky into memorable patterns. That group of stars looks like a hunter. That one looks like a bear. That one looks like a water jar. The actual shapes didn't matter as much as the fact that they were recognisable, that you could point them out to your children and say, "Remember that pattern. It will tell you when to expect the rains." Some cultures saw the same constellations differently, which makes sense because the actual positions of stars don't inherently look like anything. They're just points of light. But humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and we'll find patterns in anything if we stare at it long enough. The moon was its own kind of calendar, more immediate than the slow wheeling of stars. You could watch the moon change every night, waxing from a thin crescent to a full circle, then waning back down to nothing. This cycle took about 29.5 days, and it was obvious and impossible to miss. Many early calendars were lunar calendars, organised around moon phases. A month was one full cycle of the moon. 12 months was roughly a year, though not quite. 12 lunar months add up to about 354 days, which is 11 days short of a solar year. This mismatch created problems that various cultures solved in various ways, mostly by adding extra months periodically to sync things back up. But the moon was useful for more than just marking months. It lit up the night during its full phase, which meant you could do things after dark that would otherwise be impossible. You could travel, you could hunt, you could hold ceremonies. The full moon was bright enough to see by, and communities planned around it. The dark of the moon was different. Those nights were truly dark, and people mostly stayed put unless they had torches or really good night vision. The dark of the moon was considered significant in many cultures, a time of quiet, of rest, of things hidden, of potential. You noticed that the moon rose at different times depending on its phase. A full moon rose right around sunset, hanging low and huge on the horizon before climbing into the sky. A crescent moon might appear just after sunset, thin and delicate, setting soon after. These patterns were predictable, and once you learned them, you could use them. The planets added another layer of complexity. They moved differently than stars, wandering across the sky in paths that took months or years to complete. Ancient people noticed this and tracked it, though they didn't know what planets were. They were just special stars that moved in meaningful ways. Some cultures believed the planets were gods or represented gods, and that their movements influenced events on Earth. This led to astrology, the idea that celestial movements could predict or influence human affairs. Whether or not you believed in astrology, the fact remained that planets were good timekeepers. Mars makes a complete circuit of the sky every 2 years or so. Jupiter takes 12 years. Saturn takes about 30. If you were keeping track, you could use these cycles as long-term calendars, as ways to mark the passage of decades rather than days. And then there were meteor showers, comets, and eclipses. All the dramatic sky events that happened rarely enough to be memorable, but regularly enough to become part of the cosmic calendar. A total solar eclipse was terrifying if you didn't know it was coming, and amazing if you did. The sun disappearing in the middle of the day, darkness falling, stars becoming visible, then light gradually returning. This was the kind of event that got remembered, that got woven into myths and histories. You didn't need to understand the astronomy behind any of this. You just needed to watch, to remember, to connect what you saw in the sky with what happened on the ground. The sky was a clock, a calendar, and a story all at once. You know the festival is coming because everyone's acting different. There's a buzz in the air and anticipation. People are cleaning things that don't normally get cleaned, making special foods, and talking about who's going to do what and where they're going to stand. Children are excited in a way that makes them impossible to manage. The festival happens at the same time every year, or as close to the same time as you can manage without a standardized calendar. Maybe it's tied to the summer solstice, or the harvest moon, or the anniversary of some mythical event that happened so long ago. Nobody can quite remember when, but everyone agrees it's important. These sacred days were how ancient people organised time on a larger scale than daily or even seasonal rhythms. They were fixed points, moments when the whole community came together, when normal work stopped, and when you reconnected with the patterns that gave life meaning. Every culture had them. Days to honour gods or ancestors, days to celebrate successful harvests, days to mark the turning of seasons, days to initiate young people into adulthood, days to renew marriages or alliances, and days to ask forgiveness or make amends. These days were often determined by natural phenomena. The spring equinox was a popular time for festivals celebrating rebirth and renewal. The winter solstice called for festivals about the return of light. Full moons were good for ceremonies because you could see what you were doing. The Jewish calendar had, and has, a Sabbath every 7 days, a rhythm so regular and so ancient that it created its own temporal structure. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. This pattern repeated endlessly, independent of seasons or moon phases, creating a week-long cycle that many cultures eventually adopted in various forms. Other cultures had market days that served a similar function, every 8th day or every 10th day, or whatever interval made sense. People would gather to trade goods, exchange news, socialise and settle disputes. These market days became temporal landmarks. You'd plan things around them. "I'll see you at the next market" meant something specific and predictable. Religious observances created annual cycles. In ancient Greece, the Olympic Games happened every 4 years, bringing together people from different city-states. This was a form of timekeeping. Years were measured in Olympiads. In medieval Europe, saints' days dotted the calendar, each one commemorating a particular holy person, and often associated with specific activities or foods. Harvest festivals were nearly universal. When the crops came in, you celebrated. You thanked whatever gods or spirits you believed controlled fertility and weather. You ate well because you finally had food in abundance. You drank if you had anything to drink. You danced. You told stories. You courted. You strengthened social bonds that would help everyone survive the winter ahead. These festivals weren't just fun, though they were often fun. They were practical. They distributed resources. Everyone got fed at a feast. They reinforced social structures, leaders led ceremonies, and followers followed. They passed on cultural knowledge through ritual and story. They gave people a break from the grinding work of survival, and they marked time in a way that was communal and participatory. You remembered the year as the year it rained during the harvest festival, or the year your cousin got married at the spring gathering. The festivals were memorable by design, full of special foods and unusual activities and emotional intensity. Some cultures built monuments to mark these sacred times. Stone circles aligned with solstices, pyramids that caught the sun at particular angles on particular days, buildings with windows positioned so that light would strike a specific spot once a year. These were calendars made of solid, permanent reminders of the moments that mattered. You didn't need to understand the astronomical calculations behind these alignments. You just needed to know that when the sun hit the marker, it was time for the ceremony. When the shadow fell in the right place, the new year began. The sacred calendar overlapped with the agricultural calendar, which made sense because survival depended on doing farming tasks at the right time, and the gods, or spirits, who controlled weather and fertility were worth placating. Planting ceremonies asked for good growth. Harvest ceremonies gave thanks for abundance. Ceremonies during dry seasons begged for rain. Not all sacred days were happy. Some commemorated disasters, defeats, and deaths. These were important too. They reminded the community of hard times survived, of ancestors honoured, and of vigilance needed. They created continuity with the past, a sense that the present moment was part of a longer story. All of this happened without anyone needing to know the numerical date. The festival came when it came, announced by the position of the sun or the phase of the moon, or the blooming of a particular plant. You prepared when the signs appeared. You participated when the moment arrived. You remembered it afterward, and that memory became part of the temporal framework of your life. Someone, somewhere, got tired of approximate timing. Maybe they were organising a large project that required coordination. Maybe they were running a temple with elaborate rituals that needed to happen at specific moments. Maybe they were just naturally inclined toward precision and wanted to know exactly how much daylight was left before sunset. So they invented the gnomon, which is a fancy word for stick in the ground that casts a shadow. This wasn't revolutionary technology. It was a stick, but it was a stick used intentionally, positioned carefully, with marks made to track where the shadow fell at different times. The Egyptians took this basic idea and ran with it. They created obelisks, tall stone pillars that cast long shadows. They divided the daylight into 12 parts, possibly because they had a thing for the number 12, or possibly because 10 fingers plus 2 more seemed like a good way to subdivide things. These weren't hours as we know them. They were temporal hours, which meant they changed length depending on the season. A daytime hour in summer was longer than a daytime hour in winter, because there were more daylight hours to divide up. This seems weird now, but it made sense then. Nighttime was divided into 12 parts too, and those night hours also changed length with the seasons. The problem with sundials, and any shadow-based timekeeping, is that they don't work when it's cloudy, and they definitely don't work at night. So people invented water clocks, devices that measured time by the steady flow of water from one container to another. The Egyptians had water clocks in temples, elaborate stone vessels with marks inside showing how many hours had passed based on the water level. These weren't perfectly accurate, but they were better than nothing when the sun wasn't cooperating. Other cultures developed their own versions. The Greeks made fancy water clocks with gears and moving figures. The Chinese created incense clocks that measured time by how long it took for fragrant materials to burn. These worked at night and didn't depend on weather, though you had to make sure nobody accidentally blew out your timekeeping flame. Candle clocks worked on a similar principle. Mark a candle at regular intervals, light it, and watch it burn down. When the flame reaches the next mark, a certain amount of time has passed. The accuracy depended on the candle burning evenly, which wasn't always guaranteed, but it gave you a general sense of how much night had elapsed. None of these devices could measure minutes or seconds. Those units didn't exist yet in any practical sense, and even when they were theoretically defined, no clock was accurate enough to track them. Time was still measured in relatively large chunks, hours at best, more often in quarters of the day or watches of the night. Sailors developed their own timing methods because they needed to know how long they'd been travelling and in which direction. They used the stars for direction and rough time estimates. They used their bodies, how tired they were, how hungry, how much sleep they'd had. They watched the sun and moon like everyone else, but the ocean presented special challenges. You couldn't plant a stick in the water. You had nothing stable to cast a shadow on, so sailors became experts at reading the sky and estimating time by the positions of celestial bodies, by the colour of the water, and by the behaviour of seabirds and fish. Hourglasses appeared eventually, sand trickling from one glass bulb to another through a narrow neck. These were portable and didn't depend on water that might freeze or evaporate. You could use them on ships, in monasteries, or anywhere you needed to track a specific interval of time. When the sand ran out, you flipped the glass and started again. But all of these devices were still tied to natural rhythms in one way or another. Water flows because of gravity, which is a constant. Candles burn because of combustion, which is chemical. Sand falls because of gravity again. These were attempts to measure time using processes that happened at predictable rates, but they were still approximate, still subject to variations in temperature and humidity and construction quality. The real obsession with precision came much later, when mechanical clocks were invented, and when navigation required knowing the exact time to calculate longitude. But even in the ancient world, there was a growing desire to pin time down, to make it measurable and divisible, and to create units that everyone could agree on. This was partly practical and partly philosophical. If you could measure time precisely, you could schedule things, coordinate activities, and synchronize actions across distances. You could say, meet me when 3 hours have passed, instead of meet me when the sun is about there. But there was something else too, something almost defiant in the attempt to mark and measure something as fluid as time. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. You could do it for a moment, but it always slipped away. Here's the thing about living without clocks. You were almost never late. You couldn't be late to something that didn't have a specific start time. You showed up when you showed up, and things began when enough people had gathered, and nobody was checking their wrist wondering where you were. This drove later civilizations crazy. Roman historians complained about Germanic tribes who had no concept of punctuality. who would agree to meet when the sun was high and then show up anywhere within a several-hour window. The Romans had divided their days into hours and wanted everyone else to do the same, and they couldn't understand why people wouldn't simply comply with such an obviously superior system. But for most of human history, time was loose. It had to be. You couldn't control it precisely, so you worked with it instead of against it. You did things when conditions were right, not when the clock said to. If you were baking bread, you didn't set a timer. You watched the bread, you smelled it, you touched the crust, you pulled it from the oven when it was done, which might be sooner or later than expected depending on the fire temperature, the humidity, and the exact composition of the dough. If you were meeting someone for a journey, you agreed to leave at dawn, or after the midday meal, or when the moon rises. Then you both showed up at roughly those times, and if one person was a bit earlier or later, well, that's what happened. Nobody was tracking minutes. Work expanded to fill the available time or contracted, depending on urgency and energy. During planting season or harvest, you worked until the job was done or until you physically couldn't continue. During winter, you worked enough to stay busy, but not so much that you exhausted yourself when food was scarce. There was no 9 to 5. There was dawn to dusk if you were farming, or whenever the work needs doing if you were a craftsperson, or irregular hours based on supply and demand if you were a merchant. Children grew up in this temporal fluidity, and they learned to navigate it without stress. They understood that some days were work days and some days weren't. They understood that some times of year required maximum effort and sometimes allowed for rest. They didn't expect every day to look the same, because days didn't look the same. This flexible relationship with time meant you paid attention to what was actually happening rather than what was supposed to be happening. You noticed when someone was tired and needed rest, when animals were behaving strangely, when weather was changing, and when your own body was telling you something. Modern people sometimes romanticize this and imagine it was all peaceful and unstressed, which isn't quite accurate. Ancient people had plenty of stress, just not about being 3 minutes late to a meeting. They worried about whether the rains would come, whether there would be enough food, and whether invaders or wild animals or disease would destroy everything they'd built. But they didn't worry about wasted time in the modern sense. Time couldn't be wasted because it wasn't a commodity you possessed. It was the medium you existed in, and it flowed whether you were productive or not. This started to change when societies became more complex, when you needed to coordinate large groups of people, when trade required agreements about when goods would be delivered, and when religious ceremonies needed priests and participants to show up at the same moment. Monasteries were some of the first places to insist on precise timing. Monks were supposed to pray at specific hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers and compline. Someone had to ring the bells to announce these hours, and that someone had to be paying attention to the sky, or to a water clock, or to some other timing device. This monastic schedule eventually influenced the wider world. People who lived near monasteries could hear the bells and organise their own activities around them. "I'll meet you at the next bell" became a way to synchronise. But for most people in most places for most of history, time remained flexible and forgiving, and tied to natural cycles rather than arbitrary divisions. You didn't beat yourself up for not being productive every minute. You didn't feel guilty about rest. You didn't rush through experiences to get to the next thing on the schedule. You just lived, and time passed, and you noticed its passing through the changing light and the growing children and the accumulating memories. Something happened when we started dividing time into smaller and smaller units, when we invented clocks accurate enough to track seconds and eventually milliseconds. We gained the ability to coordinate across distances, to run complex systems, and to be exactly where we said we'd be at exactly the time we promised. But we lost something too. We lost the deep connection to natural rhythms, the awareness of our own bodily cycles, and the flexibility to respond to what's actually happening rather than what's scheduled to happen. Modern people look at their phones dozens of times a day to check the time. as if time might have changed its speed when they weren't looking. Ancient people looked at the sky, at their shadows, and at the world around them, and they knew what time it was in a way that mattered for their lives. They knew it was time to eat because they were hungry and the food was ready. They knew it was time to sleep because darkness had fallen and their bodies were tired. They knew it was time to plant because the soil had warmed and the rains were coming. They knew it was time to gather because the berries were ripe and wouldn't stay that way for long. This knowledge was practical and embodied. It wasn't abstract. You didn't need to translate natural phenomena into numbers and then translate the numbers back into action. You just acted based on what you observed and felt. Some of this knowledge is still accessible if you pay attention. You can still watch the sun move across the sky, notice the changing length of days, and feel the seasons shift. You can still observe the moon's phases, learn the constellations, and recognize the temporal rhythms in your own body. But it requires deliberately stepping back from the constructed time of schedules and alarms and appointments, and that's hard to do in a world that runs on those things. Ancient people didn't have to try to be present in the moment because there was nowhere else to be. They didn't have to practice mindfulness because their survival depended on paying attention. They didn't need apps to remind them to notice nature because nature was the dominant reality of their existence. They also couldn't escape time. They couldn't distract themselves endlessly with entertainment. When night fell, and unless you had fire or moonlight, you sat in darkness. When winter came, and you endured it. When someone died, you couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Time carried you forward whether you were ready or not. In some ways, the invention of precise timekeeping was an attempt to gain control over something fundamentally uncontrollable. We can measure time down to the nanosecond, but we can't slow it down or speed it up or get back the moments we've lost. We can schedule every minute of our days, but we can't make ourselves immune to aging, illness, or death. Ancient people knew this. They built monuments that would outlast them, told stories that would be remembered after they were gone, and participated in cycles that would continue long after any individual life ended. They accepted their own temporariness while connecting to something larger and more enduring. The sun still rises and sets on the same schedule it always has. The moon still waxes and wanes. The seasons still turn. The earth still rotates. All the fundamental timekeeping mechanisms that ancient people relied on are still functioning exactly as they did thousands of years ago. We've just stopped watching. You're lying in bed now, in a room that ancient people would find almost unimaginably strange. The light that lets you see these words comes from electricity, not fire. The temperature is controlled by systems those people couldn't have conceived of. The very concept of reading silently to yourself before sleep would puzzle them. Reading was usually a communal activity, done aloud, and books were rare enough that most people never saw one. But your body is doing exactly what bodies have always done at the end of the day. Your temperature is dropping slightly. Your brain is starting to produce the chemicals that will pull you into sleep. Your breathing is slowing. Your muscles are relaxing. You're tired because you've been awake for enough hours, because you've used enough energy, and because your circadian rhythms are telling you it's time to shut down for maintenance and repair. This is the same tiredness humans have felt for hundreds of thousands of years. The moon is out there somewhere, waxing or waning, pulling the tides, cycling through its phases. The sun will rise tomorrow at a time you could calculate if you knew your latitude and the date, and ancient people could predict without knowing either of those things in numerical terms. The stars are wheeling overhead, though you can't see them through the city lights. The earth is turning at the same speed it's always turned. The seasons are shifting according to the same patterns that governed harvest and planting for every agricultural society that ever existed. You don't need to watch these things to participate in them. You're participating just by existing, by living in a body that's still fundamentally the same kind of body humans have always had, and by occupying a planet that's still following the same orbital mechanics. Ancient people would probably be amazed by what we can do with time now, how we can coordinate actions across continents, how we can measure intervals too small to perceive, how we can record moments and play them back, and how we can seem to compress time through rapid travel or expand it through entertainment. But they might also feel a little sorry for us, constantly rushing, constantly checking, and constantly worried about being late or wasting time or not doing enough. They might suggest we look up more often, notice the sky, feel the seasons, and trust our bodies. They lived entire lives without ever knowing what time it was in the way we think of knowing the time, and they did just fine. They built civilizations, created art, fell in love, raised children, told stories, and explored the world. They did all of this while stealing time from shadows and stars and the growling of their own stomachs. Maybe tomorrow you could try their way for a little while. Wake without an alarm if possible. Let your body tell you when it's rested. Eat when you're hungry rather than when it's time to eat. Notice the sun's position, the shadow you cast, and the quality of light at different times of day. You won't be able to live entirely that way. Modern life requires schedules. But you can remember that underneath all the constructed time, the measured time and the scheduled time, there's still natural time flowing along as it always has. And natural time says it's late now, that you've been awake long enough, and that your body needs rest. Natural time says to stop thinking, stop planning, and stop worrying about tomorrow. Natural time says to close your eyes and let the darkness take you, to trust that the sun will rise without you watching for it. That morning will come whether you're anxious about it or not. The ancient people would approve of that. They'd tell you to sleep, to let time carry you through the night, to wake when you wake, and to begin again. So sleep now. The world will keep turning. Time will keep passing. And you'll still be part of it all, just as humans have always been, since long before anyone thought to count the hours.